Welcome to the GreatBase Tennis Podcast, episode 225. I'm Steve Smith, along with
Yvonne Ozerets.
Ozerets. Excited about making this phone call. We're going to talk to Jeff Moore. It's not every day you get to talk to someone who's a championship coach. An extra bonus is that he played for Jim Verdieck, one of our pillars. So you'll hear a lot about Jim Verdieck. Both Yvonne and I have written his book, Strive Together. Now he's has a company. He's working with teams, athletic departments, CEOs, companies.
Yeah, we wish we wrote his book. We read his book.
Oh, I said we wrote it?
Yeah.
Like a senior moment. That's what you need to do. I'm going to be 70 in a few days. Having a lot of those senior moments. What I said, we wrote his book?
Yeah.
I'm glad you corrected me. Correct me all day long. But let me give him a call. He's been recommended by so many people to be a guest. Paul Wardlaw being one, Joey Scrivano. Nomain, how do you say Nomain, his last name?
Currently, it's Raharanosi.
Say it again.
Raharanosi.
And the maiden name?
Oh, I have it written down here. I haven't got that memorized yet, but let me see.
She played for Jeff when he was a coach at the University of Texas. She was a guest on our podcast. She won the last match out in the semifinals for the team to make it to nationals.
Rasul Malala. That's
Say it one more time.
Rasul Malala is my guess.
And we already know that Jeff has a nickname for her. If I could only use my phone. Again, the machine is only as smart as the operator. Jeff Moore, Austin, Texas.
Hello.
Jeff Moore, thank you for being a guest on the GreatBase Tennis Podcast, donating your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
With we tease, we go back to baby food, but what a great name. Moore is a pretty common name, huh?
It is.
It's not quite like Smith, but it's
no.
With let's start with the Moore parents.
The Moore parents?
Your parents. You know, how you got, obviously they had so much to do. I really believe that, one's childhood, the parenting has so much to do with what, I'm almost 70 years old. You're a little older than I am, even though you have a good head of hair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where to begin?
My mom was born in Northeast Missouri. Her father was a professor, eventually at Kansas State and Iowa State. Her mother was a school teacher who rode a horse to school. Her dad quit academia and the family moved to Boston, where he became a bacteriologist for Hood Milk Company because he wanted to make some money, which he did. And my dad was born on Long Island, and he then moved to Massachusetts when he was in high school. That's where they met. Their parents were great friends. And so they knew each other, but my mom was 2 years younger. And she said he wasn't really interested in her until after college. They got together. They got married. My mom taught art for a few years. And my dad was originally right out of college, a high school varsity basketball coach in an independent school, Berkshire Academy in Berkshire, Mass, and taught history. Then he went to Belmont Hill School, where he continued teaching history, coaching varsity basketball, and eventually became director of development. And then at the ripe old age of 30, applied for the head job at Tilton School, went in and interviewed well. The fedora fell off during the interview. He was trying to look older, so he wore a fedora. Got it anyway, and I got my first leadership lesson from him without realizing it. Years later, when he told me the story of his first faculty meeting, he got the whole faculty together. Here he's a 30-year-old guy, and he's got all these ideas. And he laid it all out for them. This is what we're going to do. This is where we're going. This is how we're going to get there. He looked out into the audience, and they just looked at him blankly. Like there was no response, maybe even a little fear. And so he goes home and says to my mom that he's really frustrated, and he pounds the table and he says, "I'm going to rule by edict. so that was the beginning of his career. And of course, he recovered and quickly learned that even though he meant well, this wasn't leadership, this was management. He recovered, helped revive that school, was recruited to come to Tulsa, Oklahoma to build a brand new campus that is today Holland Hall School. We went to Oklahoma in 1965. People on the East Coast thought we were crazy. Are you going to live on a reservation? You're going west of the Hudson? Are you serious? Back in the day. But it was a wonderful place. I went to school at his school. He then took over. He then was recruited to merge the Kent School for Girls and the Denver Country Day School for Boys to what is today Kent Denver. And then his last job was head of the Cranbrook Schools, which is a group of, it's a highly prestigious group of schools, probably top 5. And he hated it because instead of building, changing, he had integrated at Holland Hall in 1967, which was nuts, but he did it. And he couldn't do anything like that at Cranbrook. He was kissing babies, shaking hands, very traditional. He was miserable. So that was his last job. Then he became a consultant and helped start Carney Sandow, which is a big educational consulting firm today. I was his son because he was the head of the school that I went to, which was interesting. And then I actually worked at Kent Denver before college coaching was full time. I had to have another job. So I coached basketball and taught algebra in the mornings and early afternoons, and then hustled up to CU where we lived in Boulder and ran practice. So I got to watch him in action, be around him at his school.
So an educator and a builder. I went to a boarding school in New Hampshire. Did you have siblings along the way that went through the same schooling, right?
Yeah. Which one did you go to?
I went to Kimball Union. I always tease people, say I have a Dartmouth education. It's right next to Dartmouth.
Wait, isn't that Franklin? Wait, near Franklin?
No. I mean, there's everything in New England is proximity is pretty close.
No, because that was kind of a rival of Tilton, I remember, somewhat. Yeah. A lot of schools, a lot of independent schools in New England.
But so were you in it was all boys?
Well, when he was at Tilton, I was in grade school. When we left, I was a 7th grader. So I was in public school. But the school was all boys boarding at the time. Now it's co-ed.
Yeah.
So I went to Holland Hall in Tulsa from 8th and then graduated. And he, the first year he made so many changes. He wanted to change it. It was really rich, oil baron kids dominated, and he wanted to change it. So what he did is he said, I'm not going to integrate. First, what I'm going to do is bring in first gen white kids. So he brought in a whole slew of white kids who were first generation, so that the number one student in my class, a valedictorian 4 years later, was the first person in his family to go to college. He went to Wash U and was one of the very, very early first hires at Cisco. So just tremendous life stories. So he wanted to do that to set the table so that when he integrated, the culture had changed, and so and he said that the first African-American is not going to be an athlete. So he recruited the son of the janitor in the local public school, Gary Reeves, who went on to be an award-winning journalist. He's retired now, CBS News anchor. And so that's kind of where I get my, hey, let's go push the envelope attitude, I think. I just think it's in my DNA because he had that. He's very bold.
Yeah, that's covered in your book as well. As I said, I went to a boarding school. I also taught at Deerfield and I taught at Choate. I used to think of those places as like utopia. But I remember before I went to boarding school, my parents got me a job as a dishwasher, so I would learn what it's like on the other side of the tracks. There's a big contrast to go from the Northeast to Oklahoma, especially way back when.
Oh, it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. They, the two people who came to New Hampshire to recruit him in our home, the headmaster's house, one was a guy named Jim Verdieck, who later became mayor and then a congressman. He had the big cowboy hat. And then the pastor of the Methodist Church, Linus Crutchfield. I mean, it was really interesting, but he was excited about being able to actually build something. There was a campus that existed, but it was small. And he was just excited about building something, and they were going to help him raise the money, and then he made all those changes to the school. And to this day, some of my classmates who were themselves came from very wealthy families say that when he brought in all those kids, first gen kids, it changed his life. So everybody benefited. So it was really cool to see that.
And then brothers and sisters?
I got 5, and they're all younger. We are 3 girls and 3 boys.
Wow. What number are you?
1.
Number 1.
Yeah.
I'm the youngest of 6. I always say the best comes last.
Oh, you are? Oh, you're the baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are
you spoiled?
So they say. Although but yeah, I grew up in ice hockey, and I have 3 older brothers. Went to Catholic school from the get go. But
yeah.
My mother passed away now. But I remember being 55 years old, and she would introduce me as her baby.
Yeah.
Big families. That's really gone away, though, huh? Here in the U.S.
No, it really has. It really has. I mean, my oldest sister and I essentially raised our youngest is Charlie, and a great name for a 6. And he's every bit the Charlie. He's actually he's been the director of tennis at a club in Palm Springs for years.
Wow.
The Doral, it's the Desert Princess.
So if your dad was running a boys' school, where did your sisters go? There was always a sister school, right?
He ran the boys' school. Again, I was only in elementary, so I was we all went to public school when we were in New Hampshire.
Hmm.
And then when we went to Holland Hall, it was co-ed. So I graduated from there. My oldest sister graduated from there. Second brother actually graduated from a public school in Tulsa. But then when he went to Kent Denver, my other 3 siblings all went through Kent Denver in Denver. So we all went to the schools that he was the head of, but it was 2 different schools. He didn't like to be in one place for too long, 7, 8 years. Okay, I built this. I want to do something new.
Well, we've all heard the phrase. I think there's 2 types of people: builders and maintainers.
Yeah.
With sports, I think it still stands with most private schools in the Northeast that you play a different sport each season.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? You did that, obviously.
I don't know if that's the case. I don't know that it is or isn't. We both know that that's not the case in general in society today. Specialization is big. I don't know. My dad, at one time, there was mandatory 3 sports. And then he realized, not that you had to be a star. And then it was, you got to play at least 2 out of 3. And then in the other season, you got to be in PE. But that's kind of gone away. I don't know what's happening in the independent school. I would doubt it's mandatory, but.
Yeah. But you've been a basketball coach and a tennis coach. So tell us about your sports background, the beginning days for that.
Well, I graduated from the University of Redlands in 1974 and didn't know what the heck I wanted to do. Had no idea. I guess I'll do what my dad did, but in the meantime, I worked at missions, taught tennis lessons. And then a girl that I knew, through other people, came to me and said, "Would you be the coach of the women's basketball team?" I said, "Well, why would you want me to coach?" Because there was no team. She had gone to the AD and said, "Look, Pomona, it's Title IX. Pomona has a team. Claremont has a team. We don't have a team." And he said, "Go find a coach." And to this day, I do not know why she came to me, why he hired me, because I'd never coached anything. So that I started the women's basketball program, which sounds really impressive, but I was horrible. Because I essentially coached the way my high school coach coached me. He was great, but he was very old school. Thankfully, they still talk to me because I guess I wasn't quite as tough or brutal as he was, but I didn't know what I was doing. But it was trial under fire. I did that 2 years. First year we lost every game by at least 30 points, all walk-ons. Second year, did a little bit better. Lost at the buzzer at Pepperdine on a half-court shot, so did better. And that second year, I started to coach the women's tennis team, and that was a different experience. That was a great experience. We started out in January and lost to Cal Poly Pomona, the best team in the section. In those days, Southern Cal was 2 divisions, 1 and 2. That's it. And we were in 2, and they were the top. We lost to them 8-1. And at the end of the season of the conference, we beat them 5-4. And in the process, the kids got better, and I had watched Coach Verdick, who inspired me. And the kids responded to me. I think I was a little bit lucky because I was young, and I'm sure, I still didn't know what I was doing, even though I coached basketball. But I guess they responded to my enthusiasm. They came out extra. And we finished second in the division. The Division 1 champion was USC with Dave Borelli.
Yeah.
At that same tournament. So our careers were parallel.
Well, we'll get into Coach Verdick for our listeners. I think I said this as I introduced you before we got on the air, is that several people recommended you as a guest. And I had met you, but didn't really know you. But I was in Tyler, Texas back when you were coaching UT. So for our listeners, Jeff goes, well, I had a great college coach. And I said, yeah, who was that? He said, Jim Verdieck. And I tell people I started walking backwards. I just couldn't believe he said Jim Verdieck, because I think the world of Jim Verdieck. But tell us, back up a little bit. How did you end up being a tennis player? What did you do to, that was your sport by the time you got to Redlands?
Well, I was football, basketball, baseball player. Didn't even, and you may remember this, you're a little bit younger, but back in the day, you didn't really play tennis unless you were too small or just weren't as athletic.
Right, of course, yeah.
And, I'm in Oklahoma. You play football if you're a boy. That's what you do. And then you play basketball between seasons to stay in shape, and then you play baseball. Baseball and football are the 2 sports, at least in the U.S. So that's what I did. And end of junior year, my parents had joined a local little tennis club, and they started playing tennis. And so I would go hit on the wall. And I remember one time in particular, I was hitting on the wall after a particularly bad game pitching. I threw very, very hard, but location was always a challenge. And I was hitting on the wall, and the pro came by, and he said, hey, you're pretty good. And he said, plus you're bigger and stronger and faster than most of the people we see here, and I'll teach you for free. Well, and he did, and he helped me. But truth be told, I think he was trying to sell me his last remaining T2000, which was a 4 3/4 heavy, little did I know. And anyway, he got me started. And junior year, summer. So I was very, very late in starting. And I remember thinking, yeah, these guys, come on. Does Rod Laver remember how small he was in Rosewall? And our number 1 high school player was Paul Lockwood, a name you might remember.
Mm-hmm.
Great, great player. I think he was top 15 and 18s. At the time he won the 12 and unders. But he was a great player. But he was a little guy, and probably the best touch I've ever seen from a tennis player. But I thought, I'm faster, I'm stronger, I got a much bigger serve. I can take this guy. So I challenged him. And I think I might have won a game, Steve, but in the process, I visited every part of that court. I was exhausted. And I quickly learned, number one, this isn't easy. And eventually I learned, which I firmly believe, tennis is by far the hardest sport to be really, really good at. I just had this ton of respect. It wasn't about my speed, my size. It was about the ball striking. And I hadn't had the at-bats that he'd had, so to speak. Incredible touch, drop shot, lob. Then he changed pace. And I was just, and we laugh about it today, Paul and I. But that was my introduction to tennis.
And of course, at that time, tennis was booming in 1970. James Van Allen invented the tiebreaker. Everybody and their brother was playing tennis.
Well, and Tulsa Tennis Club had a big tournament every year. Chris Everett came one year, Billie Jean King. And I was hitting on the wall one morning really early, and Brian Gottfried drives up. Imagine this happening today. And he's done everybody hit with. He said, "You want to warm up?" And I kind of went, okay. I mean, it was just, you're right. It was a wonderful time. It was a simpler time, but tennis was really booming.
Like for our listeners, Brian Gottfried at one time was 3 in the world.
Yeah.
And such a great junior, such a hard worker all the way up.
Yeah. And a really humble guy.
With football, I tell people perhaps football one day, because concussions, will be obsolete. But I mean, obviously it's arguably the most popular sport in America. But I really feel that little boys would be they would benefit so much when they're like Pop Warner, between they weigh 80 pounds to 110 pounds. I just think, there's 3 types of sports, and no contact, and collision. What do you think about football? You played it as a kid. It helps build character.
Yeah, I was obsessed with sports from a very early age. Read Sporting News. I was a Red Sox fan and made scrapbooks in the 5th grade. My buddy Charlie Plummer and I made up a scrapbook during spring training, and just obsessed. And I wanted to be a quarterback. So I'm in Tilton in the kitchen at our house, New Hampshire. And my dad, and little did we know that my dad had already decided to come to Tulsa. And he said to me just out of the blue, "If you had a choice to go to school anywhere in the country, where would you go?" And I said, "The University of Tulsa." And he almost fainted. And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because Jerry Rome. I want to beat Jerry Rome, the quarterback."
Wow.
In the 6th grade, you're living back east. No one back then, again, talked much about anything west of the Hudson. Was considered whatever. So for me to say that, he was shocked. So I was kind of obsessed with it. I would say it did build character. It was, you remember probably from playing sports in those days, the coaches did not believe in water.
Right, exactly.
I mean, I think now this is really weird, but we had very few injuries and we went both ways. And we had a line my junior year that averaged more than the Texas line. So we had big guys, in those days, if you were 210, you were a big, good sized lineman. So, but we went both ways, and, you'd cramp and they'd give you a bunch of salt tablets to get back out there. I mean, it was not good. It was not healthy, but we didn't know any different.
No, football players tell a story when they would love to be on the ground so they could lick the dew off the grass. And then when they finally gave you water, you get the soup ladle and you're drinking out of the same bucket as everybody. It's just amazing. You were weak if you wanted water. But back in those days, you would think it's true, where there was many tennis players. From football, they became tough. From basketball, they ended up having great hands, great feet. And then the throwing from baseball, and then the eye-hand coordination is so difficult to hit a baseball. So playing those 3 sports definitely made someone a well-rounded athlete.
Yeah, no question. I think playing all those sports probably gave me, in some ways, an advantage when I started coaching tennis, and after coaching basketball as well. So I wasn't just tennis. because in those days, if you were a tennis person, you grew up around a club. You grew up around a different, a certain a demographic.
Well, reading your book is like preaching. You're preaching to the choir. I mean, we have footballs here, and some kids seriously. They come and visit. They're goal-oriented players that are generally sent to us by their coach, and they really haven't thrown footballs. And you can't make this up. Where I've had kids ask me when you hand them up, we got 2 nice baseball gloves. We have 3. We got one for the lefties, and hand them the baseball glove, and they ask which hand he put it on.
Yeah. Sinner, the number 1 player in the world right now, tennis was his second or third sport for a long time. He was a very good skier, and then what was it? Soccer.
Yeah, national champion.
Tennis, and then he said, "Oh, I'm 14. I'm gonna." So one of the reasons the Europeans have had an advantage is they're just better athletes, not because they were born that way, but I don't know if it's the same. But they played other sports. Federer did, Nadal did. So yeah, no, you that's a good point you bring up.
I had a group of Canadians actually get around to talking about one of your former players. She's a mom, and her daughter was in the room, and I just asked a group of Canadian kids, how many of you go public skating? And then what I did is I showed them the clip of Center where he was a ski champion at age 12 in Italy.
Yeah.
I think of just courage, coordination. What we always say is the Central and Northern Europeans, they can all ski, skate, and play soccer. But,
yeah, definitely.
So you ended up by the end of high school, you chose tennis and went to Redlands?
I went to Knox College. I was recruited to play football.
Oh, okay.
And I played my freshman year football and tennis. And then I said, why am I playing football? I mean, it's hot. I'm not going to the NFL. So then I just switched to tennis. And then I said, well, I got to go someplace else because the tennis coach was the assistant line coach. So, this isn't going to work. Not that I was setting the world on fire, but I wanted to get better. So I began looking for a different school, and the University of Redlands had a college called Johnston College that was experimental, like Antioch or Hampshire. So we designed all your own classes, and it wasn't a traditional grind through tests, get grades, then forget everything you learned. It was really a learning environment. So that was cool. And then I go, wait a minute, who's this coach? And it was Jim Verdieck, who I did my research, but it wasn't as easy when there was no internet, and found out that, he'd been an All-American football player in junior college, beat Jackie Robinson's team playing in the Rose Bowl, was carried off the field, World War II hero. A real hero.
Yeah.
Distinguished line cross, Stanford, played in the real Rose Bowl for Stanford. And then had come to Redlands as the football coach and tennis coach, and had the only undefeated football season in the history of the school. But then he just switched completely to tennis, which he came in as agreeing to do on the side. He switched to tennis. And then the rest is history. I think 15 national championships. But
when he was at Stanford, I believe he played 3 sports, but he was the intramural tennis champion. But he always would say that he really wasn't a tennis player, but he was, like yourself, an athlete.
Yeah, and he was also the Marine fitness champion.
2 years in a row.
And I think he held a bunch of records in that way. But there are so many. He was the first American to fly into Saipan. He flew into on some other island and was shot at and barely got out, but he was determined to go in. He delivered equipment and picked people up. And so he would go into very dangerous places. Just the kind of guy, it just gives you chills.
Yeah.
To think about what he did and then to be around him, and he modeled it. And he was also very, 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 very confident, but at the same time humble. So,
we dedicated a podcast or two, had his son on. People who listen to our podcast need to go back and listen to those. He was asked very quickly, so we don't repeat the story in great length, but when he was at Redlands, he shows up at Tyler Junior College where we're training tennis teachers, and one of the students raises his hand and said, "Coach, did you ever think about applying for a big job?" And he kind of smiled and says, Steve, you think you have a big job? And he said, every job's a big job. And then he went through his resume, which he never would have done because he applied to be the coach at Stanford. And years later, I told Dick Gould the story. And Dick Gould never heard the story. But Dick Gould said he had a leg up because he was coaching the junior college right next to Stanford. And
Foothills, yep.
Yeah,
yep.
And he was very persistent. And he got permission from the Stanford AD to just wait for him to come to the parking lot. And he goes, for like 3 weeks in a row, he walked the AD to his office and said what he would do when he got to Stanford. But Dick, he just went on and he goes, well, I did this and this and this. And it was amazing. You just pretty much rattled quite a bit off. Plus his two kids, Randy and Doug, and he had won so many national championships by then.
Yeah, and I don't think he would have done well in that environment because he wanted to develop players. And in the old days, the USCs and eventually the Stanfords became, the very, very, very best players. I mean, Stan Smith played at USC.
Right.
So he told me once, he said, I don't want to babysit. I want to develop. And I don't think he would have done well. He was a straight talker.
No, I loved it.
He definitely wouldn't do well today. Definitely wouldn't do well.
I liked it when he used to say, I like to take hamburger and turn it into sirloin. When you went to college, you went to Knox College. You couldn't play as a freshman, right? You had to do the development.
No, I did. No, we did. We beat the varsity. It was a horrible, horrible varsity program.
So you must have been.
That was the last year.
Okay, yeah.
That was the last.
Yeah.
Yeah. That freshman couldn't play on the varsity.
So what were your first impressions meeting Coach Verdick? You're a young guy and just up on campus?
I just was in awe. I mean, back in those days, and this isn't necessarily good or bad, it just was, you had a little fear in the really good coaches. Today I would call it respect, and maybe we're lacking that a little bit. We got to like the coach. No, how about you respect the coach? But in his day, it was more fear, and not something that he would try to strike in you, but he just had this way about him. And I remember going to my first match, and we were all piled into a station wagon, and three of us were sitting in the front. He was driving. I'm sitting right next to him in the middle. Imagine that, in the front seat, and the teammates next to me, and then 3-4 guys in the back. And I just remember you just were in awe of him. And when I started coaching the women's team after I graduated, one day I walked out and we had 4 courts reserved, or so I thought. And his team was on those courts. And I went, oh my God, what am I going to do here? So I went up to coach and said, I just summoned my courage and said, Coach, we have these courts. He looked at me in the eye and he goes, you know what? You're right. And from then on, we developed a very different relationship. But he was the kind of person you had to earn his respect. And because he was going to, be tough and demanding, but not in a way that was confrontational or adversarial.
Dennis Vandermeer, Dennis was such a great force in the game, training tennis teachers. And he would say that Jim Verdieck taught me 90% of what I know.
He did. And at Coach's Memorial, which was on campus, he came to it. I can't remember, it was Bob Lutz and some other people. And we all walked over to the courts from the chapel afterwards in our sports coats. And almost simultaneously, we took little stationery out of our pockets, almost simultaneously. Maybe one guy started it. And each one was a letter that Coach had written us, including Vandermeer. And each one started out as, I watched your presentation. In my case, it was at Hilton Head. And, complimentary at first, and then a scathing critique. And we all just laughed. We all had the exact kind of same letter, and we just cherished that, still have it.
Coming back to respect, I remember at one point, there was Dennis, 1977, he started the Professional Tennis Registry. And when Coach Verdick, he had one warm-up that was given to him, and it was, this warm-up was like, certainly he was on the free list. He could have had anything that PTR or Dennis Vandermeer would have to offer, but it was an older warm up, but it was like in mint condition because he took care of everything. I mean, he took care of his body. He was like the perfect human being, really.
He was, and he started the teaching training coaches thing. I don't know what year, early 70s, and he would do one of the sessions at Redlands every year. Coaches would come, pros and college coaches would come from all over the country. And after I graduated and was coaching the women's team in January, he had one of his big sessions. And so I'm in the stands with my legal pad. Can you imagine? Vandermeer's running this thing. And during lunch, he had brought in Margaret Court with him, the number one player in the world. He was coaching her. So at lunch on the feature court, he would give her a lesson. And I'm sitting there with my legal pad. I mean, I was in the right place at the right time to learn about coaching and leading.
Yeah.
And a lot of it I didn't realize till much later, but.
Margaret Court, 24 majors. Billie Jean King, same thing. The movie Hollywood Beats History, in the movie, it was Billie Jean King's husband Larry King was supposedly sitting on the bench. But what really happened in that famous Billie Jean King Bobby Riggs match is Dennis Vandermeer was on the bench. And who's Dennis Vandermeer calling out, say, what should Billie Jean King do against Bobby Riggs? He's calling up Jim Verdieck.
Yeah. Well, coach would be on his coaching court, and the pay phone on the side of the gym, which was next to the courts, would ring, and he'd dash over, and it would be Dennis calling from Taiwan. I mean, Dennis talked about it openly. I mean, that's kind of a rare thing for someone that prominent, to admit that he learned and knew what he didn't know.
Yeah, for sure.
And knew who to learn from. So.
No, I think that's one of the problems we have in tennis too, is a lot of young tennis teaching professionals, maybe old ones as well. They don't really have a coaching tree. Like, where did you learn? Where, who were your mentors? Yeah. Who were your mentors?
Yeah, no, for sure.
And
mentors are huge.
With your team, in the years that you were there, I mean, you would scrimmage some of the top teams like USC, correct?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Redlands beat everyone in Southern California, and with no scholarships, except for USC, UCLA. That was it. I mean, we would, not every time, but we would normally beat Long Beach or Irvine. And it was before, these schools had, in some cases, the full complement of scholarships. But, a lot of it was because he'd bring in a player. Doug, I may have told you this before, but at the celebration, the dedication of the tennis courts, last year, actually, his son Doug spoke and gave a great speech. And during it, he called on different people in the audience. Hey, Eric, stand up. When did you graduate? 1990. What number were you as a freshman? Number 10. What did you do senior year? I won the national championship. Stuff like that. He called off 5 or 6 people from different decades that had that experience. So that's how I learned that the focus on winning is just, there's too much focus on winning, and the focus needs to be on competing and getting better every day. And that was his motto: every day is a day to get better. Yeah. And he didn't just talk about it. Oh, let's focus on the process. I mean, he lived it. We never talked about winning nationals or winning conference or winning the next match, because you can't control that. So
yeah. You always say, don't you want to get 1% better?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
He charted everything. I remember one time asking him, because when he ran his coach's clinic, he treated everybody in the clinic like it was his team. And he was charting everything: mini tennis, every drill, the bulldog nines. Yep. And I said, don't your players get tired of you always charting? And he said, well, if they're going to get tired of me charting, I don't want to count on them when it comes down to the month of May.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I define competing as making the opposition uncomfortable with purpose-driven execution. And, that I started defining it that way sometime in the middle 90s. And I'd taken kinesiology classes and I'd done a lot of reading. But that came, inevitably, that probably was embedded in me by him, because his teams were able to make the opposition uncomfortable with purpose-driven execution in the end when it counted under great pressure. So the charting and just the emphasis on that, he was relentless with that.
No, he's the only person I know who I have never seen watch a match on TV and he's not charting the match.
Yeah,
it's not like I kick back, I put my feet up. He chart. I'm never. I spent quite a bit of time with him in front of a television set, and these, Jim Lair, we spent so much time with Jim Verdieck, said that when Jim Verdieck came out of his mother's womb, he had a baseball cap, he had a whistle, and he was carrying a clipboard.
Yeah,
he was definitely, as Vandermeer would say, the coach's coach.
Well, that's another person who learned from him is Jim Lair. Jim told me once he taught him how to play. Another person from the tree, so to speak.
Yeah.
So
with your parents as educators and then Coach Verdick as a coach, you knew when you finished at Redlands you wanted to pursue a coaching career?
No, because it wasn't a career then, so to speak. I mean, you had to teach PE, and I didn't want to do that. And my dad had done what he did. And I thought, I got to do that, and got to have a full-time job. And so I applied at a bunch of independent schools to be a teacher. My applications were kind of late. I wasn't really into it. I didn't get an offer. And at that time I was back home in Denver teaching at a place called Tennis World. I don't know what's called today in Monaco.
I remember that.
Yeah. And I was teaching tennis and I can't remember who told me, hey, the Colorado women's job is open. And it just clicked in my mind. Oh, I really liked coaching and I don't have a full-time job now. Let me do that. So I applied and I got the job. The other finalist was a guy named Otis who walked in a powder blue leisure suit. He was the gymnastics and tennis high school coach in Atlanta. That was my competition. So even though I had this experience, so getting that job wasn't any great shakes. And I got it despite the fact that, and this will be taken the wrong way, but the AD, who was very much a Title IX, pioneer, called Coach Verdick and said, tell me about Jeff Moore. And Coach Verdick said, he's the only person I've ever seen who can get women to work. And she still hired me. So, and the reason I don't want that taken wrong is because the number 6 player on our team 2 years was Janice Metcalf, a female who happened to be the best women's collegiate player by far in the country, but played on the men's team. And she would die for him. So it was just a sort of an old school way of thinking, which he evolved from that sort of attitude in a big way when Title IX was in full force and colleges started to have teams, and he started to see, oh, women can compete too. But I got the job and it was part-time. So as I said before, I had to coach basketball and teach algebra at Ken Denver. In the summer, I sold tickets for the Denver Nuggets just to make ends meet. And then the men's coach at Colorado retired. And so I started to do both. And I'm making $12,600. Wow. But the women's basketball coach is making $20,000. What's going on here? But I'm making, I can all of a sudden, not have to have another job, at least during the year. And I can do more of what I love to do, even though I'm coaching 2 teams and they gave me 1 part-time assistant. I loved it. I was now coaching men and women. We did a lot of stuff together. And that was Colorado. Not much of a budget. We had to raise at least half our budget with fundraisers.
For our listeners, $12,600.
$12,600. And I'll never forget, the AD flew in. Women's basketball was becoming big. And there was a women's basketball coach named Renee Portland who'd been killing it at not Penn State, some other place. And she had played for Immaculata, which was the big, had won national championships. And I remember there's a picture in the paper. He welcomed her at the airport and offered her $20,000. I thought, my God, $20,000 to coach. And you don't have to teach. So it was wonderful.
Way back then, tennis coaches, or I should say college coaches, they had to really be successful with their camp.
Yeah.
To survive financially, because the salary just wasn't high.
Or they were, or they taught. They were a professor of kinesiology or PE or something. The coach who coached the CU women before me was a professor who did it part-time. So, yeah.
But at that time, it's a flashback for me when you say PE, because I remember I didn't really want to be a PE teacher who was teaching 20 different sports. So that's where, I became really a full-fledged tennis bum, the perennial tennis bum, Boca Raton, studying tennis. But I just think between, like, say, 74, 5 years later, sports was really booming. It's amazing how fast things were changing back then.
No, I know.
So how long were you in Colorado?
I was there 7 years, and the women just 2 years with the men and women, but was able to build up the women's program to where, with 3.5 scholarships, everybody else by then had 8. We were like in the top 20. So, and the reason is I got a little lucky because Colorado had good junior players, and some of them had gone west to school, and they decided to transfer back. A couple of freshmen from Denver. And then I recruited a player named Allison McAtee, who was top 10 in the nation, and she came to school, and she was an amazing person, an amazing player. But 1 month into her stay at Colorado, into her freshman year, she was in a car with a roommate who was on the track team who lived just outside of Boulder. And they were driving to her roommate's parents' house. And they were driving up a hill, and on the other side of the hill was an old man driving up the other side who had a heart attack, pulled into their lane, and killed Allison instantly.
Oh, wow. So,
which was horrible. And that year, the USTA named the sportsmanship award after. She's just an impressive. I mean, if my wife and I had a girl, we were going to name her Allison. She was just a special person. And her doubles partner, Kathleen Cummings, was not, and juniors was not as prominent. She was in the 40s somewhere, and she was interested. So I recruited her. She came to Texas, and she was had a average serve, average maybe forehand, okay athlete, the best two-hand backhand in the world, even as a ranked 40 whatever, and hit everything cross court. Within 2 years, she was 48 in the world.
Wow.
So just a relentless. I've never seen anyone get more out of their ability. That phrase is tossed around a lot, but she was just absolutely relentless. And so she did that, played Wimbledon, played this tour, and then she transferred. When I came to Texas, she and one of her teammates, Becky Cowan, who still lives in Boulder today, came with me to Texas. So, but she was number one on those teams, and then we had very good players behind her. we got into the top 20. So we sort of overachieved. And that got me an interview at Texas.
Tell us about Texas.
Well, I got the interview. Actually, Colorado, I hosted a tournament the last 2 years I was there with the top 8 teams in the country, which was I'm 20, whatever. And this is crazy, Jeff. What are you doing? Because I had to lay down a court in Balch Fieldhouse for the finals. And the court came from Atlanta. And of course, it's wrinkled. You know, all of this,
right,
how this goes. And so I had to get a guy to come in. And, I was a little nuts doing this. But one year, my last year there, the University of North Carolina coach came with her team, and I picked them up at the airport because nobody else could. And Kitty Harrison, and she got into the vehicle and she said, "Jeff, the University of Texas job is open." I'm an alum. That's how I know, even though I'm the coach in North Carolina. So I rushed back to the office and had my secretary asked her admin, Glenn Sparn, cobble together my resume, and we FedExed it. And I got an interview. And then I came to Austin. Definitely an underdog candidate. And I think what happened is that a couple that had interviews before me might not have done as well as expected because they had top 10 teams and been much more successful. And for some reason I interviewed really well. I didn't, I wasn't doing presentations in those days. I was very shy. But for some reason in that meeting with all these people around me, it just, including Coach Schneider, the men's coach, I happened to interview well and got the job, and now I'm in the promised land
Big
at
time.
29 and was not ready for that.
Growing up in a small town in upstate New York, even as a elementary age kid, I knew Texas was big time sports. It's huge.
Yeah.
And then actually to live in Texas. Like, wow.
Yeah.
With, so tell us about your climb. I mean, you went all the way up the ladder, won national championships.
Well, my first 6 years, we underachieved massively. And the mistake I made was, the expectations were high at Texas, and almost all of the other coaches on the staff were the Olympic coaches in their sport or were about to be. They'd all won national championships. And tennis I was the 4th coach in 5 years. And, at Texas, we were languishing in the top 20. And at Texas, that's languishing. So what am I going to do? So I thought what I needed to do, and this attitude sort of exists, this mindset today too. Well, I need to wine and dine the recruits. I need to sell the image of Texas. You're really special. You deserve to be here. We're going to win a national championship. You're going to be a big part. You love your teammates, so on and so forth. And I started to recruit blue chip players because I had no access to blue chip players at Texas. Now we're at sea level. We're outdoors, good facilities, not great, but good facilities, great academic school. But I made the mistake of trying to go after the very, very top players that the other schools were getting. And unfortunately for those players, I'm not the kind of coach that I could never have coached, for instance, at a place like Stanford, because I wasn't a manager of egos. But to be fair to the players that I coached, I didn't give them a chance. I mean, I just was not the right person for them. So we underachieved. I was also listening to too many people. The ADs trying to tell me what to do, and the marketing. I didn't have any of that at Colorado. I had to do everything myself. Not that I didn't want help, but I was really coaching from the outside in, meaning, what does it look like to the outside? I was submitting to what is still true at Texas and a lot of big schools, the image that are very image conscious. So I'm trying to please everybody. I'm trying to put a good product on the courts. And I came really close to losing my job because we had injuries. We're ranked high, and we ended up not finishing nearly as high as we're preseason ranked. And the opening team meeting of year number 7, I was going over what we were going to work on, and this is how we're going to roll, and these are our goals. And finally, an athlete, one of the players said, our practices are something like, our practices are boring. There's not enough variation. And I was not great at thinking on my feet, but for some reason I was ready. And I remember wheeling around and saying very forcefully, winning colors everything. And right now we're not winning. We're not winning on Texas terms, because we're not practicing winning. And that I felt really good after saying all of that. But I realized that night, what did I say 4 times? What word did I use? What's happened to you? And so what I started to do then is look inward and start to think about, okay, what does it really take if we're going to contend for national championships? And the first thing is stop talking about it. Stop recruiting to it. Start recruiting to a competitive environment. That's where you learned. That's where you were mentored at Redlands. So I started going after the next tier of athlete that was plenty talented but had something to prove. And one great story, Vicki Painter was one of those recruits. And I remember being at the hard courts in Burlingame, and she was typical of a lot of my recruits. She won 2 or 3 rounds and then went 2 or 3 rounds in consolation. One of the coaches goes, she was a great athlete. She'll help you in doubles, but I don't know, she'll be 6 or something in singles. Oh, okay. So Vicki and I are standing in the clubhouse. She's done the tournament, and she's waiting for the shuttle to the airport. And Frank Brennan walks in, Stanford coach. His player's in the finals. And he's there, and he comes over, and he says, Jeff, how you doing? And then he looked at Vicki and said, and I'm Frank Brennan. Who are you? And Vicki was astounded and angry. And that was the attitude of a lot of the players. But here's what's different from, I think, a lot of what happens today. Instead of coming to Texas and saying, the next time we play Stanford, I'm going to show them, they poured that into practice every day. And they actually had a cheer in practice that had a very nasty word followed by his first name, which Frank and I talk about even today. We laugh about it. I mean, that was their motivation. And it sounded very personal, and it was not loud. But it wasn't. They pushed each other relentlessly in practice. And the first year got to our first Final Four, seeded 7 and beat the 3 seed to get to our Final Four. The next year had a little bit of a slip, got to the Final 8, still a decent showing. And then Vicky's junior year, we played Stanford in the semis. It was of the NCAAs, and it was at Stanford. Big crowd. No one beat Stanford in Florida in those days. And so we're the underdog. And the team upset Stanford in front of their fans. And they actually acted like, we deserve this, but we can do this. I mean, and it's all because of the environment that was created in practice. And they just become a lot tougher over years. Even in the summer, they didn't travel with parents and coaches, entourage. They traveled together, played tournaments, pushed each other in practice. They had been part of a competitive cauldron. And the following year, senior year, seeded 5, so they're not supposed to get to the Final Four, and they won our first national championship in '93, beating Florida in the semis, and then Stanford to win. So just absolutely gives me goosebumps to remember those, just to remember having been around those special athletes and their attitude.
Jeff, let's do this. Yvonne will read the name of the player who played for you, then a question from each of the 3 players. And I think perhaps at least one of the questions, you could just reinforce what you've already said. It's always good to hear it another way. But one of you, just tell us a little bit about the player. Give us a name, Yvonne.
Yeah, of course. Christina Moros.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Christina was on the second national championship team, and that was her freshman year. She arrived as a freshman. She was the first, quote, blue chip that I'd recruited in years. And so and we laugh about this, she arrived on campus. She and Stephanie Nikitas had just played Kornikova and Hingis at the U.S. Open. So, and so she arrives on campus and she's got a little strut going, and I would have too, right? I mean, it's not obnoxious, but and we had a number, our two top players were seniors. Everybody else was freshmen that year. Kelly Pace and Lucy Ludvigova from Czech Republic, tough as nails, but they'd never played in the U.S. Open. Who are these people? So during the orientation, I'm not allowed to coach at that time because you're early in the season. Coaches aren't allowed to be involved. But I remember going up to Lucy and sort of saying, Lucy, why don't you take Christina out for a hit? And I sort of winked and she winked back. And they went out and hit the next day. And I wheeled the Airdyne out into an opening. I didn't coach, right? Because I'm exercising, but I wanted to watch what was unfolding. And Lucy, they warm up, and then Lucy says to Christina, do you want to play mini tennis? And Christina goes, yeah, sure. Because Christina had amazing hands and was a great athlete. And Lucy said, well, this is how we played at Texas. You can't hit the ball hard. You can't come to the net. No problem, Christina says. So they played, and Lucy won 11-2 or something. Just made her visit every part of the court. And then Christina's leaning on her racket, panting. Lucy said, come to the net, look me in the eye. This is what we do every day before practice. Do you want to go again? And Christina said, no. The reason I tell that story is because Kelly and Lucy essentially taught Christina and two other freshmen who were in the starting lineup and our sophomore, Farley Taylor, they essentially taught them how to compete because they had learned how to compete. So sort of like Coach Verdick, you get players to a certain point and then it just feeds off itself. When your players are leaders, it makes a huge difference. So they would take the freshmen, Nomina, Pastor, and Christina, along with Farley Taylor, the senior, on a weekend when we were supposed to have a day off, they would take them out to the intramural courts and practice. And they wouldn't tell me because it wasn't an era where you wanted to get brownie points. And they would torture them, and then they go eat. It was a great mix. So Christina ended up playing 4 on that team, and we got to the finals, played Florida. We were down 4-2 after the singles. It was when you played to 5. So we had to sweep the doubles, and they did sweep the doubles. Christina was part of that. So, and then she went on and became a leader on the next team after the 2 seniors graduated and had a great career. And now she coaches at South Florida. And
her father was pretty much Paul Terry's right-hand man, correct?
Yep. Her father came here from, as I remember it, from Venezuela and played at Texas Pan American. And Paul Terry ran into him somewhere. He was a former player teaching and just took him under his wing. And he he sort of directed the academy. He would be the guy up in the tower directing traffic. Julio Moros.
Yeah. Ivan, what was the question from Christina?
Yes, the question was, what were a couple key qualities you looked for or you felt were needed in a player and team?
Have to want to get better. So one question I would ask is, tell me about your toughest match in juniors. And they'd say something like, it was the semis, the quarters of nationals. It was hot. The fans were heckling me. I was down. I persevered. I pulled it out in the third set. I switched tactics, whatever. And I would pause and I would say, if you come to Texas, the expectation is that you'll compete like that every day in practice. So that was a way of sort of ferreting out the player that wanted to be affirmed. Now that wasn't my only approach, because I actually cared about the person more than the player. And that's how I think you gain trust, and especially if it's genuine. But when it came to what the expectation in practices was that you're going to compete at a really high level. So that's what I look for, the desire to get better and to never be satisfied. The team thing wasn't that important to me because college tennis really isn't a team. It's more of a collective effort. I mean, you on a team, and you know this, Steve, from hockey, on a team, you have a teammate you can pass to. In tennis, you got to own your court, and that's the way you give back to your team. You got to take charge of your own court. So if you're willing to do that, and you're not so much of a team player, because we had some of those, which is usually off the court. This is when we lift weights. This is when we practice. No, I don't want to do that. Well, I want special attention. No, you're part of a team. But on the court, you want that attitude. I'm taking charge. This is my court. And in that way, if I come cheer you on and you're one of the last matches on and I'm your teammate, give me something to cheer about. Inspire me to inspire you back. And so that's kind of what I looked for. And sometimes you don't see that in a 17-year-old, but you can tell it's there. It's not that I was lucky to recruit some players where it was real obvious that's the way they were wired. And then others, I could just see that as a possibility. I could see it in them and I made some, as we all do, I made mistakes as well. Sometimes what I saw wasn't real, or I didn't coach them well enough. I didn't approach them.
Jeff, thanks. What with the next player?
Well, I have one more question here from Christina. She said, or is asking, what is the most unorthodox tactic you use to coach or to get through to a player or a team?
It's a good question.
Well,
I don't want to lead you, Jeff, but in the book, by the way, I read your book also and really enjoyed it, and I'm glad I got to read it. But in the book, can you go into detail about, and you can put in your own tactic, but one of them was the cockroach one, where you put cockroaches on the floor.
Oh, off the court, yeah. Well, yeah, on the super highly competitive teams, the challenge wasn't getting them fired up. The challenge was keeping them calm. So I did all kinds of stuff before the match. It was just crazy. And we were on the road and one of these matches, and they were uptight, and it was April. And so at our old Pennick Allison courts, it's near a creek, and every spring we get crickets that come in and mate. So the facility would be full of crickets everywhere. So I scooped up some dead crickets and put them in a baggie, and I took them on the road trip. And before the match, I spread them on the floor in front of everyone, and I said, I just want you to feel like it's a home match, which loosened them up a little bit. I mean, we did all kinds of stuff like that. When I started doing that kind of stuff with other teams who weren't quite as wired that way, they told me to stop. In other words, they were nervous. They were uptight. They were anxious. They weren't too wired. On the great teams, they couldn't sleep at night before. They were wondering what the lineup was going to be, what the other coach was going to be. I mean, I had some dream athletes in that respect. They wanted to be pushed. So, but the other thing that really, and Christina used to laugh about this, in 95, the second year the team won, it rained a lot during the year. So we had to go into Belmont Hall, which was an old gym in the building attached to the stadium. And it had a fairly high ceiling, but had a tartan floor that was really worn and really slick. And we would find a tennis net and get two volleyball posts, and jerry rig a net. We'd had to get weights to weight it down, and I'm not sure it was ever the right height. And all we could do really is work on doubles. And my thing in doubles is very simple. In doubles, the challenge is find the ground. You need to find the ground on the other side. Find the ground in front of the person or behind them with a lob. Very simple. So we played a lot of doubles where that was the challenge, because you didn't want the ball to touch the net. It skidded. And we did a ton of a drill called crazy overheads. And I think that helped us sweep the doubles in the finals that year, because we just said before we were down 4-2, no one had ever swept the doubles. I don't think anyone had ever swept the doubles in the NCAA tournament. So how are we going to do this? And I just said, remember Belmont. We're getting right where we want them. And so that was one way. But a lot of, it just depended on the team. And you know this, Steve, from coaching, you push different buttons with different people on different teams.
No, for sure. Just to hear you say that your job was to keep people calm. I think today, greater levels of anxiety. Well, just go to the next question.
Next question is from Ann Pastor. It's, what advice would you give to parents whose child is wanting to play college tennis?
Yeah, first tell us about Ann Pastor.
She was on Pastor. She came from Palmer Tennis Academy and highly ranked player from France. Incredibly gifted, although not obviously athletic. She was sort of short, not necessarily super, super quick, but incredible hands. Very sweet, certainly off the court. Could take the ball really, really early. And she was a freshman on that first national championship team. And she would keep the team loose because she had this incredible dry sense of humor. She was fantastic. And she and Farley Taylor, who was a sophomore that year in 95, were our number 2 doubles team. And they were the last doubles team on the court to sweep Florida. So number 1, Kelly Pace and Christina won easily. Our number 3 team won. It wasn't easy, but it was straight sets, like 6-6 or something. And then that left it up to our number 2 team, which was through the year had been our worst doubles team. They had a 500 record, and they're playing against Jill Kravis and Divya Merchant. So this doesn't look good. Great story about. So we get to the third set. They win the first set easily. They're on a roll. Then they lose get tight, lose the second set. Third set, it's 3-all, and by now On, who's a freshman, getting real nervous. Overheads that go up it's all of a sudden it's yours. And Farley, who's a little bit older and more experienced, I'm having to call their serves because I knew Joe Kravis's game. I had a feel for Divya, so it's like calling pitches. So I'd been calling serves throughout the match, and it got to 3-all, and Farley's serving, and I said middle or body or something, and she looked over at me and she said, "Coach, I got this," like very firmly. And I turned to Kim Kettleson, my assistant, and I just said, "Kim, I think we got this," because she basically took charge, and they both did, and they won the match and swept the doubles, and it was great. But just that's what I wanted to see from my players, that they take charge, right? And I feel like in those, in so many years where the teams overachieved, when things got tough at the end, many times the players on the other team would be looking for the coach. They weren't looking for me. They were looking straight ahead. They were ready to take over their court. And I think that's the way Coach Verdick coached as well. Because that's what you want. You want them to own it.
No, that's great. I got this. What are the questions from Ann?
What advice would you give to parents whose child is wanting to play college tennis?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let them play other sports. Give them every opportunity to play other sports. I'm not so sure about the academy thing. If you're going to do that, be careful, because that's a business based on hours. And, find the right coach, but find a coach that you and your daughter or son respects, that you don't like, that's going to create an environment that will be very challenging for you. Don't go to those sessions as a parent. Don't even go to the clubhouse. Don't be in sight. And then let it be their thing. They've got to love it. And the great example of the best example of a tennis parent that I've heard in the modern era, meaning in the last 10 years, is Ben Shelton's dad, Brian, who was a rival of mine when we were coaching. But as you know the story probably. Ben Ben never even played outside the country until he went to his first Australian Open. Yeah. He played football. He played other sports. His dad coached him. Now he's lucky because his dad was a coach. But he could easily have gotten sucked into the whole, you got to play all these ITF tournaments. You got to go to an academy. You got to grind 6 hours a day. And so the kid is fresh and he loves it. And he competes. And your kid has to love it and has to want to do it for him or herself.
No,
that's most important.
That's a great answer. Thanks. So who's the next player? Or is Ann having more questions?
Just one from Ann. We have Nomina.
From Madagascar, the kid from Madagascar.
Yeah.
Right.
Tell us about Nomina. I just found out from one of her childhood friends who was here with her son is Nomena, but she said she goes with the air, Nomena. You had a nickname for her, right?
Yeah, she was Nunu, and she was a freshman on that national championship team, and she was vying for the number 6 spot, but we were sort of rotating people, and she really wasn't slated to play 6, and we put her in against Stanford in the semis, and I don't think I told her till like right before the match, and she went out and destroyed a senior on their team named Amy Chimanoa. And Christina will tell you this, and we were all just laughing hysterically because she was just on a roll and having so much fun. And that was a real key to our victory. And she was great because she would work hard and she was a great student and a great teammate. And she also added, as did On, and Lucy from Czech, she added something because she came from another country. So she added a perspective and an experience and a background that our Americans had not been exposed to. And I just really think it made a difference to have players like that on the team. And usually they were very thankful to be there because they were coming from another country where they didn't have, all that we have here in terms of coaching and all the resources. So she was absolutely fantastic. And Nomina has carried over from that experience she's an entrepreneur today. And it takes, especially today, it takes a lot of courage to start a company from scratch. And you don't do that unless you're a competitor. So I think the lessons she learned carried over for sure. Obviously, she had some of that in her, and she's also very, very bright. But it's a lot of fun to see what these athletes do when they move on, not only in their careers but also with their families. She's been great.
The genetic input. I don't want to take away from the dad, but the daughter, Callie, she's a Ferrari. She's really, really fast. I'm going to guess it. I mean, it could run all day.
She's really fast. Yeah, that's right. You're working with her daughter.
Yeah, no, Nomina would be the last person to say this, but and the coach perhaps shouldn't have said it either. But as of January, people age out in Canada. They go birth year by January 1. She'll be 1 in Canada in the 12th. What are the questions from Madagascar? I like just saying that, Madagascar.
Well, from Nomina, we have, what strategies did you use to promote competitiveness within the team while maintaining cohesiveness?
Great question. My whole thing was to create an environment, and this is where coaching basketball and obviously my experience learning from Coach Verdick really helped. And at Texas, I kind of lost this, what I'd started to do at Colorado. And my first 6 years, I kind of became a more conventional, we're just going to hit balls till the cows come home, and then we're going to run sprints, and we're going to look really good, and so on and so forth. But I finally got back to my roots, my Coach Verdick roots, and realized I needed to create an environment that challenged them, and I needed to create problem-solving scenarios, a competitive environment, but not competitive in terms of you win, you move up, or you lose, you do push-ups, but create scenarios where they would have to solve problems to win. I kind of learned that from basketball. In basketball, the coaching is really, really good, and they will develop situations where, for instance, 5-on-5, you can't score till you've reversed the ball twice and entered and re-entered the post twice. And they'll create these scenarios that are really difficult, because once you play the enemy, the other team, it's not a deal where you could say, hey, do you want to hit cross courts? I can hit 100 in a row. You want to see who can hit 101? That's just not the deal. The deal is, I'm going to make you uncomfortable with execution. How are you going to respond? And so I wanted to create an environment where my players would develop that attitude. My job wasn't to lecture, to teach, to instruct. My job, I felt, was to cultivate, meaning create that environment and then ask them questions. How can you solve this? What are you doing with your serve right now? Yeah, you're hitting it hard, but you just lost 40-15. You just lost the game 40-15. So you did 100% first serves, and they were big, but they were strike zone. So what are you going to do next game? What are you going to do with your serve to make her uncomfortable? So I would ask questions selectively after setting up those kinds of drills, because I think that's what I think, and that's what I learned from Coach Verdick. That's what he was able to do. Because in the end, they've got to own it.
Oh, that's great. That's your only question?
That is, yes.
Here's a question, Jeff. Andy Brandy, the late Andy Brandy. I was 22. I worked for Andy. He was 24. He was my boss for a couple of years with All American Sports. What it was like? What comes to your mind thinking about competing against the Andy?
Oh, we were intense rivals. We had a very different approaches to coaching. He was a little bit more command and control. He had some great players. And we went back and forth. We were able to, pull some upsets, whatever. We had great battles. And even though we were two very different people personally and as coaches, I felt like there was tremendous respect between us. And I really, after he retired before me, and when he retired, I said to myself, geez, because I wanted that pushback. I wanted that challenge. And he's passed away, of course, but I saw him, he coached the LSU men's team, the last, 4 or 5 years of his life. And they came to Austin for a match against the Texas team. And I think it was NCAA's round of 64. And I went over to their practice. I hadn't seen him in years. And, we just talked about how much we missed the battle. That's what we missed. We didn't talk about rankings and all that stuff. We just missed that battle. It was just wonderful to come back together in that way. And the same goes for Frank Brennan, who was a third personality, completely different, but very challenging to go up against.
With someone who I've met through obviously junior tennis, one of our players, Larry Secchi, played at Vanderbilt, and Jeff McDonald. In his book, or in your book, you are very humble, but he's somebody else like Andy Brandy, yourself, Frank Brennan, won national championships.
Yeah.
He says that you really helped him out. How did you help out Jeff?
Well, that's a fourth completely different personality right there. Jeff and I are very, very close friends. We talk probably once a week, at least, still to this day. And he called me up in 2015, and I just started my leadership coaching. And we hadn't talked in a while. We were good friends when we were coaching against each other. We played in the the quarters in '93, and when he was at Duke. And so we'd been rivals, but we'd been friends. And he had a pretty good team. They were, I don't know, between 10 and 15 or something projected to be. And he said, can you come help me? And I said, help you, Jeff? You're a veteran. And he just wanted to hear a different voice. And I think he'd been struggling. He'd had some entitled players, and, he's such a good guy, and he's such a great relationship builder, which is the key to leadership. But he just wasn't able to recruit. And I found this to be true my years some of my years too, you just wasn't able to recruit competitive people who had that inner drive. But he had a good group, and they were a little bit underranked, great potential, great kids. He said, "Can you come help me?" So I went out and worked with the team, and then continued to work with him throughout the year. And they ended up winning the national championship. And then in the post-match press conference, he was asked what's the secret, and he said it all started with Jeff Moore, which is ridiculous because, I helped him, but, it was more of a sounding board and suggestions about practice, just what I wish I'd had, to be honest, from someone into my career. But that sort of propelled, at least with tennis coaches, my leadership business. And of course, I went right out afterwards, and coaches were like, "So tell me about what you do." And I would say, "Well, if you want to win a national championship, I have to charge you a premium rate." I had some fun with it and started working with a lot of coaches in a lot of sports. But we have stayed close to this day. He is still working in the athletic department, but he's also involved in solar energy. And he does some teaching on the side. And he might be one of the best relationship builders I've ever been around. He knows how to build a trusting relationship with an athlete, and then he knows how to challenge them in the right way.
I was going to say, as a writer, I know at one time he was writing for the New York Times.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess that he was, years ago, would ask his players to read The Art of War. Very quick story on Jeff. He's being flattering. He's coming in, and he's telling this young girl I'm coaching that obviously she knows a lot about the nuts and bolts and how to strike a tennis ball. But she wasn't very patient, and she ended up going to Vanderbilt. She wasn't so patient in the rally, which is a good thing in some ways because she was looking to attack. So I tell this story quite often. Is he asked this young girl, I believe it was from the Korean War, so, what do you do when, you're being shot at from foxholes? And, then you got to explain what a foxhole is, and then the answer is, the U.S. Marines are going to wait on their belly. And they're going to wait and wait and wait. The art of war is, I just remember that's a pretty deep thinker to think, okay, let's have you stop and, just think about being a Marine, and someone who's at ground level, shooting at you.
Yeah, no, he's an incredibly bright guy, a brilliant writer. And he's also was self-taught. He played at Virginia for Homer Richards, who played for Coach Verdick, by the way, won Wimbledon, and then became the Virginia coach. And Jeff, in his senior year, we came in and the expectations weren't high. He had one loss all year, won the ACC, beat some great players, including Andy Andrews and some people like that. And he came in second for Athlete of the Year at Virginia behind Ralph Sampson. And I found that out on my own because I just nominated him for the College Hall of Fame. But he was almost completely self-taught, and he taught himself how to compete. And he's been a great friend and a great resource.
And Andy Andrews, 82 in the world. He built the indoor courts at NC State. Tell us a little bit about Paul Wardlaw. We love Paul Wardlaw.
Paul's great. We met at a convention, the coaches convention in 92 or something. And I'd given a presentation on my 3-step footwork, and he came up and said, "That's interesting." And then he was at Kenyon at the time. I think they might have already won a national championship, or they were on their way to doing that. We struck up a friendship because, like Jeff, he was a thinker, and he was always looking for ways to get better. And he taught me about the importance of building competitive relationships. We all talk about that, but he had a way to go about it with his players that was really ingenious. And we became good friends and colleagues and remain so. And he actually triggered what became my the framework that I used for leadership when I was an AD in a local school here after I retired. And I noticed that the kids were entitled. The parents didn't want to put their kids in tough situations. They didn't want them to compete. And I called up Paul, who was still at Asa Brown at the time. I said, Paul, these kids, their parents just don't want to compete. What's the deal? He said, go on dictionary.com. I pulled it up. He said, what's the definition of compete? Well, Paul, it says to outdo another for prize or supremacy. Okay, now scroll down to the bottom. What's the origin? Just strive together. What does that mean? If you and I compete, Steve, hockey, tennis, whatever, one wins and one loses, but there's tension around it. We go after each other relentlessly. We make each other better. That's what competing was. That's what it meant up until about 25 years ago, I would say. And then we started to move toward collaboration. Sort of an all means everything means nothing word, perfectly harmless, but we started to lose that edge. So he triggered that, and so I started to, at the school, in the athletic handbook, with his help, I said, we're going to help your kids build a strong relationship to self, team, and coach. And this is what that means. And that's what's important. Oh, he's been very important.
Yeah, he certainly knows. I think people think of Paul with Warlaw directionals, but he's somebody you could learn so much from, not just the X's and O's and ball striking patterns. I also spoke to Bob Haugen. I know you guys worked like 25 years at camps. He was your assistant. And I now and then I speak to Roger Fulmer, who spent some time with. He's a coach at WashU, as you know. Bob asked me to actually ask you about the 3 steps. You brought it up. Jim Verdieck used to do this hop, skip, step. You get kids on the baseline, and if it wasn't really, the court wasn't being spread, and the ball wasn't really driven with an angle to the corner, you pretty much can just, and he would just get people really close to that baseline, hop, skip, step. Could you go back and just talk a little bit more about the 3-step?
Well, what I learned is I watched a player named Machir. Do you remember him? From
the
Czech?
The cat.
The cat. And I noticed he wasn't taking little steps. And then I noticed, oh my God, essentially to 80% of the balls, he takes 3 steps to every ball. And the last step is the plant foot, and he ends up hitting open stance. And I said, we're just too much in a rush. And I'd been writing articles about getting to the ball as fast as you can, these cone drills. And, I'd talk to track coaches, and it was just so wrong. It was not right, because I'm thinking to myself, well, great players make it look easy. How do they make it easy? They're not in a rush to get to the ball unless it's, unless they have to. And I started watching, tournaments on TV, and I noticed, 10, 10% of the time are they running all out to a ball, and otherwise they're measured. So I started, with every freshman, I would start, with 3 steps. I would toss, and I would just toss a ball to the right or the left. And I said, I just want you to take 3 steps every ball, and start. The first one would be the outside foot, and then the second one would be a crossover, and the third one would be plant and lift and hit. And what that tended to do was it made them more efficient, more grounded, more explosive. Sometimes it would be a quick 3 steps. Sometimes it would be a long 3 steps. And if you watch Sampras, old films of Sampras, he would take 3 steps from one corner to the other on that running forehand. It wasn't unless he was running off the court and had to churn and just sprint. He would, if it was the kind of running forehand where he would, rip it up the line, it was always at that 3rd step, and he just glided. So I felt like, and that really helped calm them down as well.
Along those lines, Bob asked me to, we discussed it, and he asked me to bring this up. RTP, respond time, prepare.
Well, we had fun at tennis camp. Bob would run the camps and did an amazing job of that. And we would talk about, we had to have themes. A lot of camps, feed a bunch of balls, make them sweat, make sure they have fun and all that. But we wanted to teach them, regardless of the level. I just, off the court, we had some activities. So I'd sort of, I sort of adapted the 16-second cure to respond to a bad shot, take your time, tee, and then prepare. And then, so I just invented RTP. But the other thing we did in camps was we used the same framework I used in coaching, which was we designed everything. Each day wasn't forehands, backhands, volleys the next day. It was point building day, first strike day, finish, capitalize and finish day. So, because my whole coaching was designed around tactical mindset. So because in a point, you know this, Steve, you go up there to serve and you've gotten a chance to first strike. What does that mean? Ace, winner, or create that, short turf ball on the return and then tack the net and win the point. That's the first strike or hit a winner. If otherwise you're in so-called neutral, I'm a big fan of that word, not a real action word. To me, it's point building. So you and I are both in quote neutral. And so I'm going to deliver body punches. I'm going to hit through the court, penetrate, push you back, make you give me another three-quarter court ball, which I will then hopefully capitalize on. What does that mean? I'm going to move you, spread the court, they say. And then I get an even shorter ball. Now I'm going to attack, which means I come to the net and then I finish. So I wanted them to think in terms of that mindset. What am I doing right? Try to create a first strike here. Or I'm in point building mode. What do I do? And then, because the key isn't how well you hit your forehand, is how do you use it? So we did that in camp and we had a lot of fun with it. We did all kinds of skits and different. One time we had a point building day. We had my manager, was a former Marine. He came off the light pole on a wire. The kids were sitting, you couldn't see him. He has gear on, his black, his army uniform on, and he came flying down on the court and delivered me the point building oath. We all raised our right hand and agreed to persevere through point building. I mean, we just had a blast with it.
With you and Bob, obviously, spent so much time together. I have in my notes here, tactical mindset. One phrase he used is that you were really big on your players being able to drive the other player back. Could you comment on that?
Well, yes. To take advantage of, I would call it capitalizing, which isn't necessarily you're coming to the net. If I push you back, or if I start with a serve and you give me a three-quarter court ball, let's say, a ball where I can hit it across the single sideline. I don't need to go through the court. I can get you moving. I want to make you uncomfortable with execution. And so that's a big opportunity. So that's capitalizing. And then hopefully I get an even shorter ball where I can now attack and then finish. When I started recruiting in my later years, I would ask players, how do you win points? And I remember asking this one player this question, and she said, I'm an aggressive baseliner. I said, well, I don't want your brand. I don't want your style. How do you win points? And then just blank, blank, blank. And I said, oh, okay, how do you get to the net? Well, I never go to the net. I'm a counterpuncher or whatever. I said, well, how would you get to the net? The point being, every point should be designed so that you're going to finish at the net, even if in that match you never get to the net. So your serve isn't great, but how can you use it? Should you be taking advantage of more opportunities to win points instead of just trying to outlast them? Understanding that much of it's going to be attrition, a war of attrition, but to be a better player, you're going to have to win more points than you are right now. So that was sort of the idea there. Begin with the end in mind. So construct every point with that being the goal. And it just makes you be more aggressive, at every step of the way, in a percentage way.
No, it's great. Thanks. With another person who highly recommended you come on as a guest is Joey Scrivano, who's been at Baylor for 22 years. I don't know if we have time for all of them, but why don't you give us a question from Joey for Jeff? I think he sent like 15 questions.
Yeah, he sent 13 questions.
13 questions. So when I asked him for questions, they came back within the hour.
Yeah.
Tell us a few things about Joey.
Well, he was at South Alabama before Baylor, and he would come at least 2 years. He came to the camp to work the camp and to learn, and we would have long discussions about coaching. I would do something during lunch. I would run a practice for the instructors who wanted to come out. We had former college players, some high school coaches, and Joey. So I would run a practice, and tongue in cheek, I would push them and challenge them, and they had great fun with it. So I think he learned from me, but I also learned from him. He was a wrestler, so he sort of came from an all sports background as well. So he was tough, and he wanted his players to get better. And then, of course, he got the job at Baylor and has done quite well. So he's been fun, and we still stay in touch.
Oh, great guy. Oh, go ahead,
Yeah.
Yvonne. Give us a question.
Football throwing technique. How does throwing a smaller football high and far with tilted shoulders enhance a player's serve mechanics?
We had him throw a football. I remember Aunt Pasteur doing this, and at first feeling funny doing it because she wasn't a natural thrower and giggling about it. But I just had them throw. I put one player on one side of the 10-foot fence, 15-foot fence, and another player on the other side, and I would have them play catch over the fence. The reason being, unlike football, and you know this, Steve, when you're serving, you have to hit up. And so that motion can't just be, ground level, flat. And so that's how we would work on the service motion, because you have to roll the shoulders, but you also have to be hitting up. So that's what we would do occasionally before practice. And then we would take the football out, and sometimes during warm-up. I was big in warm-up on not making it super structured, because especially coaching women, when they come to practice after a day of classes, they've got a lot to talk about and a lot to get off their shoulders. And so warm-up is not going to be strict, and many times I'm not around, or I'm walking around chatting with them about their day. And we would, on the jog and stretch, a lot of times we do the football as they're jogging and stretching, as they're jogging to warm up. So that's how we incorporated it.
Oh, that's great. Give us another Joey question.
Arm speed from pitching. How do you use principles from baseball pitching to build arm speed in tennis serves?
Well, a great pitcher doesn't try to throw hard. A great pitcher repeats the same mechanic over every pitch, looks exactly the same, even though it comes out of the hand differently. And the velocity that pitcher is capable of is just there within the motion. There's not an effort to try to overthrow. So the same thing goes for serving. And the pitching analogy was, I felt like I was calling pitches, and I wanted the players to think that way. And pretty simple. Steve, you're shading to the forehand. I need to go up the tee on the deuce side or into the body. So I think one thing players don't do enough is they're too much in their own heads. Oh, my serve doesn't feel right. Oh, it's not going well, or this or that, or the weather, or the wind, or the sun. Well, where they should be focused on, like a boxer, on their opponent. How can I hurt her with purpose-driven execution? What's she doing right now? And Paul Wardlaw calls that empathy, by the way. Really interesting thing I learned from him. When he first said that, I thought, oh, empathy off the court. Put yourself in someone else's shoes. Yes, but on the court, he meant, I'm nervous, but look at my opponent. She doesn't like those high balls. She looks nervous too. So like the boxer, you want to pay attention to what you're doing or not doing to make that person uncomfortable. And I think a lot of coaches miss this, especially young coaches. They'll go through practices that are high energy, but there's no attention to detail. So again, the serve's big. Everybody's running around. Everyone's getting sweaty. Everyone's howling and cheering and chanting. But what's happening in terms of execution? So
that's great.
Baseball's key.
Let's go with two more from the Baylor Bears.
Why prioritize core and lower body strength over heavy weight training, and what benefits have you seen?
Well, the power comes from, number one, your power comes from the ground reaction force. So that's why you see a lot of tennis players and a lot of pitchers who have these big hit, they're thick through the trunk and their legs, but their upper body is relatively slim and not as built up. So with the upper body, it was more building muscular endurance. As you know, Steve, the rotator cuff exercises because of the wear and tear. So we focused more on muscular endurance and worked more on, we had a phenomenal strength coach, Bulgarian strength coach, who at one time was the IOC, not USOC, IOC strength expert. We were so lucky to have him. His name was Dr. Angel Spasov. He was phenomenal, and he got our players in amazing shape. And this is one of the things he focused on, is lower body and core.
Let's go with one last one. Thank you.
What's the impact of your unique 3-set practice format with a double-weighted final set?
Well, Coach Verdick taught me this. I don't know if he taught me. I just obviously picked it up just by watching. He always wanted to prepare players for the toughest possible situation. So a lot of times if I paired two players up, one player would win the first two sets 3-3, and I would wait the second. I would either give a handicap to the player who'd lost the first two sets, or I would simply say the loser of this set does suicides or whatever, does sprints, to put more weight on it in the end so they would complete it. I also did a little round robin that Coach Verdick taught me. He called it Bulldog 7. So every player would play in the round robin. Each match was a total of 7 games. The 7th game was always a tiebreaker. So you could be up 5-1 and you still play a tiebreaker. The winner of the set gets 1 point. The winner of the tiebreaker gets a half a point. Okay. So in other words, you could win all the sets and none of the breakers and still not come in first. So it put pressure on the player to win that breaker. And I had some players who weren't very happy about the fact that they won all the sets, but didn't win the breakers, and they still had to run. So that's something he taught me. Again, putting players in positions where they have to execute under pressure, creating an environment where that happens.
Oh, this is fantastic. Let's go bonus round. One more from Joey.
One more. How do you train mental toughness in practice, and what techniques are most effective?
I think you create an environment that's a problem-solving environment. You challenge your players to execute under pressure. And that, more than anything, engenders what I call emotional toughness. I remember talking to Jim Lair when he wrote mental toughness training, and I said, Jim, it's really not what do I know? I'm not a psychologist like him, but I'm thinking, it's really not mental toughness, because mental is what am I going to do with my serve here? What decisions do I make? Which is really important. It's how do you respond? So it's more emotional. The 3 dynamics you're dealing with at all times at the same time, and it's physical, the ability to hit a forehand, to run, to endure, mental, the decisions you're making, what shot to hit, and emotional, how you respond. And so I was always thinking of those 3 dynamics and trying to put my players in a position to where they had to make decisions and they had to respond when things didn't go well. And it's interesting, but recently we live right now in a time of toxic positivity in sports. It's just gotten out of hand. Now, negativity obviously is horrible, but the whole notion of things aren't going well, just tell yourself it'll be all right, is ridiculous, because you know this, Steve, from playing sports. If you get into a bad patch, you can't the positive self-talk doesn't really help per se, because you can't control the outcome. So what Djokovic does, which I don't necessarily care for him particularly, I'm not sure people like him, but he's an incredible competitor. And the reason is he gets into a bad patch and he says to himself, this really sucks. This isn't good. And then he's talking to himself. What are you going to do about it? So that was what I was looking for more out of my players. And it was in terms of the self-talk. But I wanted to create an environment that did challenge them in that way. So I think that's the best way to do it.
Oh, that's great, Jeff. Let me ask you a personal question. You're at the University of Texas. You've won. You're right there. You're knocking on the door. You won national championships. Tyler, Texas. We had a bunch of kids win high school state titles back when everybody was playing high school tennis, and as you know, the finals were played at UT, and it was just a big deal.
And the quality was high.
Yeah, no, I certainly had the off factor, just like the juniors, to get to go to the Texas campus. And, you would remember these names: Clayton Stanley, Chad Clark. I think they were on campus when you were. But how did you decide? In fact, Coach Snyder, this was a really big time for us at Little Tyler Junior College. I was speaking at a tennis teaching conference in Dallas, and he sat and listened to me, and I sat and listened to him. And then he asked us if we would help him because he had a lecture class, an elective on coaching tennis. And of course, we were just gathering information from all these different coaches. So we had a connection to Coach Snyder. But my question would be, how did you decide to leave the University of Texas? I think people would just think like you were on the top. You were in such a great position, the kind of thing that people would die for.
Well, I was getting, okay, I'll tell you exactly. I probably waited too long to retire because it got to a point where I would drive into the work from Lost Creek, and I would always go the same way, of course, and I'd get on and field. And I started thinking, how many times have I made this trip into work? And, and I tell coaches today, I wish someone had said to me, Jeff, you started to ask that question. I needed a new challenge. I started to get tired of it. And the problems that before with athletes, with administration, that before I might have looked at as a challenge or handled well, just started to get really irritating. And I just needed something different. And I needed a new challenge. I had been doing it, by the time I retired, I'd been doing it already 30 years. And I started when I'd never done anything else. I'd been, I'd coached and taught in school a little bit, but that's what I've been doing. I just needed something different. And it worked out perfectly because the last year we were seeded 11 and got to the finals. So it was a great run and it was a good time to go out. But I needed to do something different. And the day after I resigned, I had this feeling of euphoria that I can't even describe. I mean, like I was on drugs or something. I was just so happy. And because I was ready to do something new, I wasn't quite sure at the time, but I just needed to do something new. So, and I think it would have been more fair to some of those players if I'd retired earlier. Cause, to be a really good coach, and this, Steve, you have to be a little nuts to coach, and especially tennis, which is a hard sport, and especially because every day is based on the whims of 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Right?
Right.
So you've got to be patient. You've got to be understanding because you were that age one time. And so you've got to be a little bit fanatical to even want to coach in college. And if you're not, you need to do something else. It's not a job like many jobs that you just go to, make a good living, come home, and hopefully you're a great parent. But it's not that way. You've got to be a little bit obsessive and addicted and passionate. Once you lose that passion, it's time to get out.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm always telling people that days are long and decades are short. We really don't have that much time, and to go on and do different things, I can see where you.
Yeah. And since I've retired, what I'm doing now, I've probably learned more in the last 10, 12 years than I learned the previous 25. And the reason isn't because there weren't great people around me. It's just that I'm now in other coaches, other CEOs' elements, and I get to see them work. You know what I'm saying? When we're coaching, we see them on the recruiting trail, or we talk to them on the phone or conferences, and we learn. But now I'm in their element, and it's just eye-opening. Like getting to work with Jeff McDonald and watching him work, it's magical. So
I'll give you an Andy Brandy answer. Back in the day when Borg, he got the 6 Wimbledon finals. He had won 5 in a row. And as you remember, he was going, how could he stop? How could he stop? And Andy used to say, well, he's won 5 Wimbledon finals. And then the question was, if somebody were to climb Mount Everest and they come down and go, when are you going to do it again? When are you going to do it again? So I think that's an interesting thing. To move on to, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say to move on to what you're currently doing. Besides reading your book, I listened to a podcast, an interview of yours, and you mentioned the Lawrenceville Prep School. I remember going to a hockey tournament, right next to Princeton for a couple Christmases. But it was about education, and he said a physics exam, the average grade was B+. 3 months later, same test, same students, the average grade was F. I think that could be a good lead-in for you to talk about education and what you're doing now.
Well, I grew up around a head of school. My sister is a longtime teacher, a great teacher in school. So I've grown up around education. I majored in educational psychology. So I have a sensibility about it. I don't call myself by any means an expert on education, but I went to a college that didn't have grades. We were evaluated with narratives. So we were evaluated not by the product, the outcome, but what went into getting an outcome. Just like in sports, the key isn't, your desire to win, to paraphrase, to adjust what Bobby Knight once said. Your desire to win, he said, is determined by your desire to prepare. I would say your desire to compete. And so it's the same thing in school, where if you know you're studying something to take a test, here's what happens typically. You don't learn, you absorb content, you regurgitate it on a test, and then, as proven by research like what was done at Lawrenceville, all the class got an average grade in physics on the exam of B+. They took the same test 3 months later, and the average grade was F. So you're being tested on detached, disassociated information. So it's not really, in my mind, it's not learning. So we'll never get there, because education is by far the most change-averse industry we have. And it's getting worse because the focus on grades, to the point where now at some Ivy League school, the average grade is A. So not only the grades not work, but now it's just gotten out of control with grade inflation. So I work with schools as well, and I have a very good friend named Kevin Moore, who's a constructivist who I worked with at the school as AD. We talk every week, and constructivism is sort of what I learned to do coaching, where you create an environment and you inspire them to gain access into their own learning. And then you start using Socratic methods, asking them questions, pushing them to get better, and then making it a community to where they share and ask each other questions. And it's because it needs to be about learning, and our schools are not preparing learners, they're preparing studiers. So when you get into the real world, you have to be a learner. So I have to learn this to do my job. Then I study. In school, it's the opposite. You study something and you don't learn it. So schools are not preparing us for today's real world, where problems don't have, many times, either have several different possible solutions, or there is no solution. You've got to invent, adapt, and reinvent. That's the real world, and school doesn't prepare you for that. What do you remember from college? I remember courses where I used what I heard in class, where I went back and read or I talked to the professor. I don't remember the other classes.
No, for sure. I love your phrase, test them, grade them, rank them. It's all reflected in what's going on in education with tennis and the UTRs. People aren't interested in if you're learning to go to the net or learning to hit a volley, low backhand volley. They just want to know what your UTR is and nothing else. So sad.
Yeah.
Let's do this. Yvonne, why don't you ask a question, then I'll ask a question from your book, Striving Together or Strive Together by Jeff Moore.
Yeah, I was trying to think of some thought-provoking questions because I agree with everything you write in the book. One question is, and you've answered it as we've talked here, but do you see competitiveness and the want to win as two separate entities? If so, do you see the balance between the two as a fine line or a complete mindset shift?
Well, if we're talking about sports or, I guess, success in life and business, do you want to win? Do you want to have success? Of course. But you can't control that outcome. So control what you can control. And that is, what are my challenges today? Am I putting myself out there? Are you focused on what goes into winning, on what goes into an outcome? And I think what the world needs right now, and I'll just go ahead and use politics. Here's the way politicians used to lead. It's never been messy. There's always been corruption. It's never been perfect. So there's a boxing ring in Congress, and the Republican who disagreed with everything the Democrat was saying and vice versa, they would both get in the ring and they would debate and they would negotiate furiously. It would even get gnarly, and they would come up with something that was best for the country. So what I think people need to do today is demonstrate the courage to compete, to strive together. Work together is fine, but what does it mean? Okay, Steve, I'd rather that we work together than not, but there's no meat on that bone, and everybody has a different definition of it. Strive together means you're willing to move out of your comfort zone, to solve a problem unconventionally, to learn new things, to persevere through all that, and to push each other. And we've just lost that. We've lost that ability, and I think it's the willingness to compete in the way I'm describing has been lost. It's just not there, and we're too focused on winning to the point where, again, I'll use politics. Well, the Democrats didn't get that passed. We won. No, or anything that even looks like a win. And this goes in business, in sports. Who was it? Tom Brady said the other day, parents, stop putting your kids in places where they can succeed if they're struggling where they are. Stop putting them on a different team where they can succeed. Put them in tough situations and challenge them to work it out. And it's not the millennials. Everybody blames kids in the social media. Us baby boomers raised them. We're the masters of personal brand. We're the masters. We raised them to build their resume from the womb on, to get a trophy for participating. Branding, which has just killed us. Personal branding.
Yeah. Why don't you go on that? Arrivers and strivers. Why don't you talk about personal branding?
Yeah. Well, a striver is a person who is driven by a purpose that transcends winning. They don't talk a lot about results. They're too immersed in the process of getting better. So a striver makes a decision based on how would this make me better? An arriver is what we're really suffering from, an arriver mindset today. An arriver will never reach beyond his or her grasp. A striver is always reaching beyond his or her grasp, always reaching for something different, always putting himself out there. An arriver will hesitate to reach beyond his grasp because success must always be within clutching distance. So arrivers are afflicted with ROCD, results obsessive compulsive disorder. Anything that they can possibly do to compare favorably to the competition is where so in other words, Steve, you got a 3.7, I got a 3.9, or it doesn't matter how low the bar gets. My whole goal is to compare favorably with the competition and play it safe to do that. So John Wooden once said, your character is more important than your reputation because your character is who you are, your reputation is who people think you are. Well, today it starts with reputation. It starts with what's my brand, which is determined by how many clicks you get, how many likes you get, what other people think. We need to start looking inward and deciding, am I going to do this? Am I going to take this? Am I going to move out of my comfort zone to solve this problem and learn? Am I going to take a chance? Or do I need to protect my brand? We never used to brand people. We used to brand things. And reputation is important. My dad always used to say it's the most important thing you have. But what he meant is your reputation is an outgrowth of your character. It's inside out. We live in an outside-in world.
So well put. Go ahead, Ivan.
Thank you for that. One more question I have is Timothy Galloway, in his book, Inner Game of Tennis, he describes his meaning or take on true competition, and he describes it as a wave and a surfer, where a surfer doesn't look for really easy waves. He doesn't look for the most difficult waves. He finds the wave that challenges him the most, and he relates that to tennis, where you're looking to compete and find a player that just challenges you enough where you both are challenged. Do you find that analogy to be in line with what you believe competition, the true meaning of competition is?
Very much so. And Rafa, who just retired, what was the best among the best role models for this, because he would try to rip your heart out in the match, and then after the match, whether he won or lost, invariably he'd talk about the result of the match, but then he would pivot to how much better he was getting every day. He was a clay court player, right, Steve, early on, and his serve had to improve. He had to improve his court position. He had to be up in the court more. He had to do some things that a lot of players who were already making a ton of money wouldn't want to do. And he wanted to compete at a higher level. And he had, to your point, Elon, he had tremendous respect for his opponents, and he wanted a great competitor is a little disappointed if they're not pushed. So, I think that's very true.
In your book, Mediocre State University, my mother had a sign in her kitchen that said, don't accept mediocrity. I use the term to get kids' attention. I stink you. But here's one thing, always coaching Darrell Royal, when he tells who Darrell Royal is, and casual bump-ins. What's a casual bump-in?
Oh, good. I got to know George Bush when he was governor and was running for president, because he was in the weight room. We'd have long discussions. And I've met chief justices. I've met all these people. And, you have your little bit of nerves or whatever. But the only time where I've really been, oh, my God, was when I was in the Barton Creek Country Club locker room with one other person, and it was Darrell Royal. I was so nervous because I had really studied him. And he had a way of working with players that was ingenious. And where I got casual bump-ins is one of his many stories and one of his many, many quotes that I heard at the College Football Hall of Fame when they have a little thing where they have some audio of him. And, he would run in, he was always coaching. So he would run into an athlete on campus and say, great tackle. How did you know to make that block? How did you know to execute a trap block instead of going straight ahead, or great tackle, or a way to persevere through that. And that was just through a casual, what I think coaches need to do more intentionally. I think a great coach, a great leader creates intentional serendipity, which doesn't make sense, meaning it looks like it's informal. It looks like it's serendipitous, but you're ready to do a little coaching in that moment. He also said to me, you know what potential means? I go, no, what, coach? He goes, he ain't done it yet. So just great stuff. He was awesome.
Go ahead, Ivan. Again, thank you. I have one more question here. I have two more, but this first one, balancing coaching and teaching. So in our world, coaching is a human relationship and teaching is information transfer. If you're asking questions, and in your book you give a lot of examples on how to have your players have more of a striver mentality, and you give examples of asking them lots of different actual questions and having a conversation. How do you balance that with the actual teaching side of it, where you're trying to get them informed and educate them on a certain part of the game or something you're trying to get through to them?
Well, what I learned is that one important lesson, at one point, our athletic director at the time, Donna Lopiano, a legend in women's athletics, really bright, really smart. Without her, I'm not sure there ever would have been Title IX. And she said at one point early in my career, all my coaches have to have master's degrees. Imagine that. I'm thinking, what? I got 2 young kids at home. I don't have time for this. But I had to get one. So I picked a master's program that would be relatively easy, sports administration. I thought, well, I'll take these courses. It won't be too much. And they said, well, you have prerequisites. I go, what are those? The prerequisites are anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, and motor learning. I said, what? This is sports administration, not coaching, or not that. Why would it didn't make any sense? Well, I took those courses and they completely changed my coaching philosophy. And the reason I say all of that is in motor learning, I learned that you always teach technique within the context of tactics. So you create an environment, because invariably, it's what you do with your forehand. There's no such thing as a generic forehand. So I learned that I was doing too many repetitions and that the learning curve was flattening out. But I was like, we got to do it more. We got to be perfect. Well, it's never going to be perfect. And then I remembered as a basketball coach, why do basketball coaches do drills for 2 minutes max? Like as Wooden used to say, you're not going to get it perfect today, but 2 minutes over 5 days, over 10 weeks. And then they're doing it on their own in the summer. That you need to do those repetitions, but then immediately put that stroke into context. So that's what I started to do. And I drastically changed the way I taught technique, to the point where I really wasn't teaching it. We would do a drill called yo-yo, and this was later in my career, where 2 players would start at the net very close to each other, 6 feet from the net, each player, and they would hit the ball in one bounce and then move back with 1 step with each stroke all the way to the baseline, and then in. It's like an accordion, and then back in toward the net one step with each stroke. And all I would say is present your racket, lift and don't bend, and lift and stretch, lift and brush, lift and brush, lift and brush. That's all I said. The reason I said don't bend is because you're going to bend when you need to bend. And power doesn't come from the depth of the bend. It comes from the speed of the contraction anyway. So I just didn't want to fill their heads with a lot of minutia, and I wanted them to develop their stroke by doing that drill, which made them create shape, right? And then coming in, it made them dip the ball, which they would have to do when the other player came to the net. And so I created that drill, and then did some drills to follow up that taught technique within in the context of tactics. So that's kind of how I learned. Those courses were amazing.
You're giving us a master class, our listeners as well. Comment on from your book, from your life, from your work, being authentic. Well, it comes down to treating everyone the same, treating every situation the same. You elaborate upon that in your book.
Yeah. Well, I learned from Wooden said something. John Wooden said a lot of great things, and one thing he said is, it's not about being fair; it's about being equal, and that really resonated. Because if you're being fair, everybody gets the same amount of playing time. You're too roped into feelings, and feelings are very important off the court, because hopefully the coach cares more about your development as a person than an athlete, which builds on the athlete portion. But once you're on the court, it's got to be equal. You have an opportunity. And Coach Verdick was that way as well. So that was an important distinction I learned.
It's interesting. Today, we're up here in the mountains in Wintergreen, Virginia, and Yvonne and I were at the NCAA. We were in Waco because now, what you couldn't do, obviously, during your day, is the matches. You just push a few buttons and you can watch any court from the beautiful campus at Baylor. So there's a young boy. He's in the quarters. I've coached him for 10 years. And so the quarters is a good run. And so the person I think he's going to play in the next round is someone I've only worked with for one day, someone who came in to be videotaped. So I've been working with this young guy for a decade and really very close with his dad. And, his dad's calling me and texting me. And I go, no, there's already too many voices. He doesn't need to hear from me. Now, we have immersion camps where people come in. It seems like it's certainly information overload because we start with video and ball striking and match play. But what's your comment on overcoaching?
Well, yeah, there's too much of it. And, one of my great players on one of the two seniors on the second national championship team, Lucy Ludwigova, who's now the coach at Brown. Her name is Lucy Schmidhauser. When she was raised in Czech, her brother was much older and escaped communism over the border, was shot at, spent 6 months in an Austrian refugee camp, got to the U.S. and became a star NHL player. I think we talked about this, John Ludwig.
Yeah.
Led the league in penalty minutes. Anyway, so that was her DNA. And in a communist country in those days, the sport was selected for you. So they said, you're going to be a skier. So she was a skier. Then she was a track athlete. And finally, she was tennis. But the tennis practice would be, here are two balls. Lucy, you and this other girl, you go up to that court on that hill with a chicken wire fence and play a match. And by the way, if the ball goes over the fence and goes in the river, you better hustle and get it. And so she didn't really have a lot of coaching. Now, the technique suffered a little bit, but she was very, 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 very tough. And she knew how to compete. Not that you want to go to that extreme, but she had to be resourceful. Tough as nails. So I think the key is to create an environment where they have to figure it out. I mean, you create that environment and you're teaching, as you said, on comes and selective. But there are certainly times when you have to say, no, I think you ought to do this with your racket, or think about doing that, or technique-wise or tactics. There are some times when you actually instruct. But the rest of the time, it's putting them in an environment and helping them figure it out. I used to do a drill where second serve returns. So, Steve, you're hitting second serves and I'm hitting second serve returns. And the only way I can win a point is to hit a winner. So what do I do? I'm a freshman, you're a senior. What do I do? And you can win a point any way you want. We're going until somebody, until I get to 3, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to try to put the second serve return away. Well, you get to it. You may get to it and win the point, or even if you touch it, you can't touch it. So this goes on. Meanwhile, you're piling up these points. And by the time I get 2, you got 10, and then we switch sides. And then as a senior, you've been through this and you know what needs to happen. So what do you do to me? You take that second serve a little bit earlier, you move me to one side, right? And then the ball comes back a little shorter than that. You move me to the other side, you come to the net and put the ball away. So it was a way I would just sort of stand back, and the freshman would get really pissed off and frustrated. I just say, figure it out. And pretty soon they have to figure it out to construct the point. So that was one example of what we did.
Speaking of Czech tennis, the former Czechoslovakia, I was fortunate in 1987 to be there to study tennis. And I always share that the number one takeaway for me was the players were there to set up the court before the coaches came. Then the coaches left and the players were the ones putting all the equipment away. Just the opposite of what we do here.
Yeah.
I think for our listeners, your book, just page 82, I love these thought-provoking questions you have. Page 82, have you ever entirely learned a new skill? Then we're big on going to the net. We'll chart a match and 100 points go by at a high level and no one's hit one overhead. Yeah. You go to a weekend tournament, say 12s, 14s, you'll be there the whole weekend and not see one overhead.
Yeah.
Yvonne, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yes, I have here two more questions. In your book, you talk about you visited a Barnes and Noble and the miscategorization of leadership under the management section. We mentioned how teaching is information transfer, where students, from my own experience, you walk in, okay, I have a teacher, they give me information, I will have pass or no pass. It's binary. One thing is you talked about also about Kevin Moore, who
Yeah.
in your book, I mean, it was amazing to you recounted the story of how he taught his students, and it reminded me very much of a teacher I had in my high school where I only had him for a semester because of different changes the high school was going through. But even if I just had this professor or teacher for a semester, he stuck with me, and I always see him as someone that if I were a teacher, I'd want to be much like him. And he did very similar to what Kevin Moore did, where he broke us up into groups, gave us tasks, and it was very he cultivated an environment rather than just shot information at us. So my question is, do you think that teachers should be viewed less as teachers and more as life coaches specialized towards like a given subject?
I think so. I don't like the word teach. I like the term cultivator of learning, which, because an assignment would be completed and he would look at it and he would say, this can be better, and give it back to him. Or a student would go to the board in math class and he's big on math as a big idea. I mean, he's a math, he's teaching. He would teach fourth grade during the week and tutor advanced calculus on the weekend. And he's a brilliant guy, but the kid would go to the board and solve this problem or try to solve it in her own way. And Kevin would then look to the rest of the class and go, what do you think of that? Have you considered this? Well, what about that? And just as you're saying, he would create an environment where they had to figure it out. And the students and former students love learning, and they keep in touch with him to this day. Many of them that he had years ago, they're now in the work world. He's amazing. Absolutely amazing. He cultivates learners and people who love to learn.
No, thanks, Jeff. With your website, so many amazing testimonials from like every sport under the sun, athletic directors, athletic departments. My question, I've spent years and years with the late Vic Braden, and Vic was a licensed psychologist. Well, I'd say the last 25 years of his life, he didn't go anywhere without John Nienagel's book on brain typing. And obviously that Myers-Briggs is it's a tool. It's not scientifically validated, but CEOs, ENTJ, they cannot not lead. I think many times a tennis parent, you run into a lot of CEOs. So someone has to be the boss. But I mean, what comes to your mind how do you deal with a CEO, the typical CEO, the double A personality?
Well, it would probably more come under whether I'm a direct report of that person or whether I'm the CEO, am I a manager or a leader? And so I think this will help answer the question. So I wasn't big on personality. I have an assessment called the Strivership Quotient, and it assesses your willingness to strive together in relationship to self, team, boss, and direct reports. And it measures, and a psychologist helped me build it. It wasn't thrown together, believe me. It evaluates performance attributes, because the limitation of a personality profile is I could say to you, Steve, well, I just gave you the Myers-Briggs. I'm a licensed psychologist. You're an introvert, and you're saying to yourself, I'd rather be an extrovert. Oh my God. And then I tell you though that you're in sales, Steve, and research has shown that the very, very, very best salespeople are introverts. Why is that? Because they listen. So you leave knowing yourself, but personality is very fluid, and we have to adapt our personality. So what I wanted to do is to devise something to help people adapt, and it's performance related. So what I learned, and I've learned this through working with people as much as what I came up with on my own, is that if you're my direct report and you're doing, or an athlete, whatever, but let's say you're my direct report, you're on my team, I'm your boss, and you're doing great work. If I'm a manager, I'm going to message you, be in my office at 8:00. You sit across from me, very formal. Great job, great progress, especially on this part. Oh, and by the way, here's the assessment, that we live by, these attributes. And I'm going to give you a 4 out of 5 in resilience. That's an attribute. I'm going to give you a 5 out of 5 in problem solving this week. And we'll talk about it in the meetings. And it's on, and the attributes are on the wall in every room in this building. The problem with that approach, which is a pretty typical approach, is those attributes or core values or whatever they are, they live in the abstract. It's well-meaning. I start a meeting, Steve, with, all right, everybody, we're going to be problem solvers today. Then we meet. Then at the end of the meeting, I go, way to be resilient. I mean, it's not attached to anything. So what does a leader do? A leader, if you're doing well, Steve, I'm going to get off my butt and I'm going to do a walk around. I'm going to come to your workspace, but for all you and your coworkers know, I'm just walking around. But I'm going to create intentional serendipity. I'm going to come to your workspace. Hey, Steve, great job on this project. You're making great progress. But then I'm going to pivot to, by the way, how did you solve problem X? You must have had to come at that 10 different directions. And or you had to break down every door in this building to get it done. Tell me about that. And by this time, I'm sitting in your workspace. You were relentless in that meeting or that practice last week. And I let you go because we came out, the team got better. You got better, the team, everybody got better. That's challenging on your team relationship. You got something out of Sally. You called on her. We're not quite sure about Sally yet, are we? She's a little different. She's kind of shy. No one's quite sure they like her, but you knew she had something to contribute and you got it out of her. That's empathy. That's another. So in other words, challenging them to focus on what goes into solving a problem, to raising their level of performance. Because the number, if we're in sales, for instance, or we're trying to win a conference championship, that number, that goal's on the board. But why are we talking about it? You can't control it. And you can't control trend. Why are we paying attention to our chances of winning the conference tournament? We need to pay attention to what we're doing today. What problems are we solving? So long-winded answer.
No, it's great. Just with talking to Bob Haugen, I preceded that phone call. Speaking to Roger Fulmer, who at WashU, they want to bring you in. Tell our listeners, the assessment. How can they work with you? How could they benefit through what you've put together with this company?
Well, typically, what I do, whether it's with a company, whether it's with a business, or a sports team with a head coach, is it's either a workshop that I do with that group, in which case I'll work with the CEO first, and then go to the site and then do a workshop with the CEO and his or her leadership team. But they all take the assessment beforehand, and it's online, and they don't get the results. The results come to me. I make hard copies, and I bring the hard copies to the location of the workshop, and I give a very short presentation, and then we do lots of activities on the different relationships where they have to get in pairs and so on and so forth. And then I hand out the hard copies of their assessment results, and they're staring at them. And I talk about the assessment because now it makes sense. We've talked about these relationships. We don't dig deep into each person's assessment, obviously, but they have the hard copy. They know how it works. Then I meet with each person one-on-one, and we dig deep into why is, what jumps out at you about these results. That's the way I started. What do you want to do about that? How does that look to you? What does that mean? So we'll do that. And many times that leads into the second part of my business, which is consulting, which is what Roger's interested in, where I would go in and do something very similar with the team, but then also go to practice, or in the case of business, go to the business people's meeting. And my focus is always first and foremost working with the head coach or the CEO, whoever is the leader of the team, because I'm not there to coach the players. I'm there to provoke them, to make them uncomfortable, but then to work with the CEO or the head coach into how to cultivate competitiveness in his or her team. So that's how it looks.
And ideally, how long is a workshop? Depends on the variables? Or?
Workshop is usually, the workshop itself is 4 hours. And then, if I have 10 people and they each have an hour, I meet one-on-one, which often goes into the next day. And then typically I will follow up with the CEO or the head coach. There'll be an arrangement where I keep checking in with that person over like a 6-month period. That's usually the timeline of the engagement.
And the core principles are pretty much the same, if not exactly the same, what you tell a team and what you tell a company.
Yeah. Yes. And I do not do not portray myself as an expert on management when we're talking about business, for instance, processes, management, information. I mean, I distinguish management is about process and systems. Leadership's about people. So it's strictly, how can you continue to do a better job as a leader instead of trying to get the most out of your people, that's what a manager does. Often well-meaning. A leader inspires and empowers her people to get the most out of themselves, a much higher bar. So how can you become better? And there's better at that. And people like Darrell Royal just did it intuitively through the way they built these relationships, through the questions they asked, through the challenges they didn't really, it wasn't instructive, it wasn't mandated, it wasn't indoctrinated like some old school coaches. It was an environment that is created. So it's just about the people when it comes to business. I've learned a lot about this, but it's basically the same thing that happens in the sports world. How can a team and the members of that team get inspired and empowered to do things, to stretch beyond what they perceive to be their limitations? How can you create an environment where they do that? It's the same thing in business or in sports, as you know.
Yeah, no, you've been so generous with your time. Yvonne puts together a review list, but one thing before you read some of these points, and certainly you can jump in at any time. But going back to Coach Verdick, you made a comment that he couldn't coach today. Certainly what we're trying to do with our efforts with giving out free educational content is to try to carry the torch of, we have 8 pillars, and Coach Verdick being one of them, and Braden and Vandermeer and Burwash. I mean, you would know all these people. Mm-hmm. Some of them have passed. To put on your hat as an innovator, how could a Coach Verdick make it in today's society?
Really, really good question. A bunch of us, almost a year ago, we had the dedication of the new Verdick Tennis Complex at Redlands. 350 former players showed up. It was so inspiring. A bunch of us went to dinner. A bunch of us from different generations. So they didn't know me. I didn't know them. One of my teammates was there, but everybody else. And they started talking about how he taught technique. He would want to keep the racket on the swing line and, the wood rackets. And a lot of what he did was not biomechanically efficient at the time, but it worked. And so I'm throwing out these terms, some of which I've used today, and none of them knew what I did. And they're kind of looking at me, what? And I said, well, Coach Verdick did things very differently than the coaches before him. He was a real coach. Now I'm doing things differently from what he did them. However, there's one thread that runs throughout, and that is creating the competitive mindset. And that's why leadership, and he was a great leader. I would hope to be a quarter as good as he was. Leadership principles have never changed throughout history. Management has changed tremendously with technology, obviously. But the principles of leadership, and by the way, we used to have great leaders, were the same when George Washington was president as they are today. The same principles. They have not changed. The culture's changed, certain important cultural changes, but those things have never changed. So, that's kind of what he taught me. And he was doing things on the court that were considered, might have been considered blasphemy by older coaches. So, but he was just he was always learning and always trying to get better.
No, a good example of that was, so I was in the Vandermeer camp. I was also in the Braden camp. And at one time, they were the two biggest names in the tennis teaching world. And years ago, I would say, certainly like say the forehand, at one point it was so bad. It was like use one grip for everything. And, then the shake hands in the backswing and shake hands on the follow through, the 180-degree swing on a 20-degree court. But I remember, spending a lot of time with Coach Verdick. Once he knew that I'd spent so much time with Braden, he wanted to, he was all ears. He was all ears. Yeah. Vic, it's looked upon now as old school, but, he certainly, just again with getting aerial in high speed film and like just even like closing the racket face people thought at one point that was radical.
He was ahead of his time with all the video. But
I do think that, like you said, the character, the principle, maybe it has to be packaged, presented a little bit differently, but, for Jim Verdieck, I one time, you get a kick out of this, with my last name Smith. I was talking to Peter Smith and Stan Smith. I was at the NCAs. The joke is at one point, everybody was named Smith, silversmith, blacksmith, goldsmith. And I was telling them as each person sinned, their name was changed. So if your name was still Smith. So anyway, I think I told you this on the phone a month or so ago, is that Stan Smith, his freshman year, had to take the developmental year, and he was working with George Tolley. And he's gone, George Tolley is the greatest college coach of all time. And then I said to Stan Smith, I said, what about Jim Verdieck? And he looked at me and he said, Jim Verdieck. My father used to put me on a bus, and I can't remember if it was Randy or Doug, but one of the Verdieck boys would beat him 6-0, 6-0. But every weekend he didn't have a tournament. Those are the stories. I love the backstories. Stan Smith, Wimbledon champion, US Open champion. When he was a little kid, he was put on a bus to go from Pasadena to San Bernardino, and take lessons from Jim Verdieck.
And Coach never promoted himself. It was, people don't know about him, which is kind of sad, which is one of the reasons that Seabury Stanton and I are talking about writing this book, which would be a leadership book. But
we need to get him online. He was a guest at my house, and Stephanie Ray called up, and I think she must have been like a top 10 player. So he's doing this workshop for us, and he's talking to Stephanie Ray, and he'd be the last guy to.
Stephanie Ray was at his dedication, and also he coached Sandy Collins, who ended up being top 50 in the world, and Becky Bell, who later coached at Arizona. Yeah, he coached a ton of those players, and his kids were great.
One thing I wanted to ask you, thinking about rankings, I forgot, was Beverly Bowes. She played for you. Wasn't she really ranked like say top 50 before she even went to Texas?
Yeah, she was. Yep, she was ranked in the world before. She was number 3 in 18 and unders, I think, when she was like 14. So, and her dad, Mickey, was the coach at Texas Tech. Loved her dad. He's passed away since, but yeah, she was a great competitor too. She didn't have much of a backhand, but she was smart, and she used it to get forehand. She big, as you probably remember, big forehand. And she would use that backhand, to get a forehand. She had to be smart. And I always loved that kind of player that had preferably the big serve and the forehand. The backhand doesn't work real well. That's all right. We'll do whatever we can to get a forehand. As you know, the forehand's a better side to have as your weapon.
I think that Beverly Bowes was part of this match. I was fortunate. It was Laura Hanna, actually, who was from Tyler, Texas, and I coached her. She was at A&M, and through that, they were in between coaches, and someone from the P department ran the women's team for a bit. And I got a chance to, for 5 years in a row, I went to Texas A&M to train tennis teachers. And just for our listeners, when I had you on the phone, obviously your team didn't lose to A&M very often, but I was on the A&M campus and it was an upset. It was like, whoa, we beat Texas. I think Beverly Bowes was part of that. When I told that, you remember like the year it was and who was on which court, what the.
She wasn't on that team.
No.
It was 85.
85,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That was not a fun moment.
But I remember she was big time. I remember seeing her at the Orange Bowl and knowing we were going to interview, I was watching her play Steffi Graf. She tells a story about playing Chris Evert where she got beat. The match went 2 hours and 20 minutes. She got beat 6-0, 6-0. But the amazing thing was that Chrissy herself called up and said, "Hey, will you be my practice partner?"
Yeah.
Yvonne, why don't you share a few points here and we'll let this fine gentleman take a breather.
Jeff, thank you for your time. Actually, I did have one more question pop up. It's a quick one, if you don't mind. You in your book, you described the cult of perfectionism and how it's becoming more and more prevalent. What would you recommend for people, players, anybody that would like to leave that cult and not get so sucked up into that whole perfectionism mindset?
I'm not remembering. I think that might have been an allusion to letting things get messy. Things have to get messy before they become better. So great example of that. I had the opportunity and the pleasure to work for the Clemson men's soccer team, and the coach called me up and said, my players love each other off the court. They live with each other. They're great in the weight room. They will not engage fiercely on the pitch. So I traveled to Clemson. They had just lost in the semis to Notre Dame, and this year they wanted to win it. And I think they won it a couple of times, but I watched their practice and they were just sort of going through the motions and they were trying to make every pass, every corner kick perfect. And it was sort of robotic. And this coach, Mike Noonan, is a phenomenal coach, had not, sort of like my career, he'd not been that way at Brown, where he was before, where he had no facilities, no budget, and they won the Ivy League. He'd been scrappy. And I said, Mike, why don't you have them scrimmage? He said, they're not ready to scrimmage. He said, it's going to get messy. I said, well, and furthermore, why don't you go up in the tower and just watch and see what happens? And he had them scrimmage. It was in the spring, and it was really messy. But we emphasized, where's the pass that's going to lead to the pass? You need to tackle that guy. That person cannot get to that spot. And again, problem solving. And by the end of the engagement, they were doing the same kind of drill practice they'd been doing before, but there was much more of a sense of urgency around it. But basically, they had to let things get messy first before they can get better. And I think too often that goes back to, let's hit 100 balls in a row to get the forehand perfect. Well, it's never going to be perfect. So volume is important, but you get to a point and two things happen. The learning curve's flattening, number one. And number two, let's move on to how you're going to use that forehand. And then you incorporate it in a drill that's messy and unpredictable and a little bit random. And the stroke actually gets better. So I think that's addressing what you're talking about from the book, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah, it is, of course.
Go ahead, Yvonne. Some golden nuggets from Jeff Moore.
On the notes here, appreciate your time. I enjoyed very much listening to you, Jeff. Thank you. Here's my notes from our past 3 hours here. He's every bit the Charlie. Tennis here. Back in the day, coaches did not believe in water. Tennis is by far the hardest sport to be really good at. Europeans have an advantage because they are better athletes. I don't want to babysit. I want to develop. Too much about winning. Every day is a day to get better. Can't control winning. Not an ego manager. Have to want to get better. College tennis is really a collective effort on the court. Doubles, Find the ground. Academies are businesses based on hours. When looking back, you miss the battle. Perseverance through point building. Points should be designed to end up at the net. Begin with end in mind. I enjoyed the Bulldog 7, I believe you called it, the round robin format. That I never heard of that. That was great.
Yeah.
It's a time of toxic positivity currently we have. So I liked how you described that. Asking yourself, how can this make me better? ROCD results obsessive compulsive disorder. Reputation is the result of character. A great competition is competition is disappointment. They are not. Sorry, let me repeat that. A great competitor is disappointed that they are not pushed. Intentional serendipity. That was great. I've never heard of that. Potential. You ain't done it yet. Teach technique in the context of tactics. Cultivator of learning. Management is about systems. Leadership is about people. And the last line I wrote down was messy first before you can get better.
Oh, Jeff, thank you so much for all your time. I know people will love this masterclass.
Thank you. It's been fun, and I've learned a lot as well.
Tell us again your website. How do people get in touch with you?
It's moreleadership.com. And that's where you can find contact information and all the information on the work I do. So,
you and I are at the age where there's a book. It's called Everything Reminds Me of Something. When I was a young guy that's correct. I was a young guy trying to train tennis teachers at Tyler Junior College. John Moore, he had spent at least 25 years in the service and saw a lot of tours at Vietnam. So I think of the last name Moore. Actually, I never coached the Moore family up in Toronto, but certainly met all the brothers and the dad, and that's the story in itself. But Harry Neal, a hockey player, hockey coach, and commentator, TV analyst, said about the Moores. I mean, all three boys went to Harvard. All three boys were drafted to play in the NHL. Two played in the NHL. One was injured. And anyway, Harry Neal said if there's a Hall of Fame for parents, Mr. and Mrs. Moore are in. But no, I appreciate your book and how you talked about your parents' background, in particular your father's background. And then again, I'll never forget what I talked to a lot of coaches, and you said, "Well, I had a great coach." And I just go, "Yeah, who was your coach?" He said Jim Verdieck. Amazing. But it was your former teammate that you told me that we should interview?
Yes, Seabury Stanton, Seabury. He's phenomenal. I can send you his contact info.
I did read one piece that you mentioned. It was something for the university that he wrote.
I'm sorry?
He wrote one piece. I remember the name.
Yeah.
And then I remember, talking to Doug Verdick. Actually, we tell coaches all the time on our podcast with Doug Verdick, he reads the letter that Coach Verdick gave to every freshman when they came in. It's very, very moving. And I tell all these young coaches, just push pause and go back and word for word write that letter down, and it all stands the test of time.
Exactly. And I'm just so I know you probably feel the same way. I'm just so blessed to have had the mentors I had and to be able to work with leaders today and continue to learn. It's fun. And sometimes I get too carried away with learning, trying new things, but it's what drives me. I think
I might have already mentioned it, but on your website, once again, the testimonials are from every sport and this, that, and the other thing. But no, this has been very moving. Thank you very much. I know it's been a long afternoon, a marathon. Actually, the way we run marathons today, this has been two marathons.
And it's been a lot of fun. Thanks to both of you for your questions. I appreciate it. It's fun.
Yeah. You definitely have helped a lot of people out through this. All right, Jeff. Have a good day. Rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good night. Yvonne, baby. Wow. That was amazing. Yeah, people need to read his book. And then actually, in training coaches, this podcast masterclass, what I would say is, and people are so busy, especially young student athletes, but people that are in our world of coaching tennis, make time, even if just listen for 10 minutes to that, and then get out a pencil and paper. As Coach Verdick would say, get the clipboard and put your brains down. But podcast 225. Is that right?
Correct.
225. Wow. Everyone, adios amigos. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff Moore. Thank you, listeners. Thanks, Yvonne, for putting these together.
Thank you, guys.